Once again, for everybody who has not yet met me, hi, I'm John Tabor. I'm the president of Loudon Photo Club. Welcome to tonight's presentation on mastering long exposure. Tonight's speaker is a commercial and fine art photographer, author, tutor, and speaker, and his work specializes in architectural and urban images and images using long exposure techniques. He's written a number of photography books available globally, including the best-selling Mastering Long Exposure, the Definitive Guide, published by Ammonite Press and National Geographic. You can see more about his published books on his website, and his links I will make sure are available. He's won numerous photography awards and recently a Hasselblad Masters 2021 finalist. He was just discussing that right before we started the recording. His images have been published in a wide variety of books, magazines, television, and for advertising, as well as displayed in a variety of locations around the world. He also regularly talks on various aspects of photography to a range of clients and also runs a range of tutorials from private classes to group lessons. Tonight's speaker, Antony Zacharias.
Thanks, John. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. Just so everyone knows, obviously, I'm based, hopefully from my accent, you can tell, obviously, anyway, I'm based in London, in the UK. So bear with me a little bit. It's just turned midnight, 10 past midnight for me. But fabulous to be here, and thank you very much. And a big shout out to Rick. Hi, Rick. Lovely to know that you're here listening too. I'm going to share my screen, and then hopefully we can see if I find my keynote. Here we go. So hopefully now everyone, John, you can see my presentation. Here's all my contact information, my website, antonyz.com.
Hey, Antony, I'm not seeing your screen.
Oh, okay. That's no good.
It worked a little while ago.
Yeah, it did, didn't it? Here we go. Let me try that again. So we do share screen. This one.
Still not seeing your slide.
No, I'm just going to click that.
There it is. It's coming up now. Yep, got it now.
Perfect. So brilliant. Sorry about that, guys. Right. So welcome. My talk on mastering long exposure. It's based on my book that John's just kindly introduced. My contact information, there's lots of free tutorials and guides and things like that. It's at antonyz.com, AntonyZ photo on Instagram. Do reach out. I'm always happy to answer questions if anything arises or you don't want to ask tonight or down the line. So always happy to help. Do feel free to make a note of that. And you can always ping me a message. As John's kindly introduced me, I'm not very good at talking about myself anyway, but I'm proud to be a brand ambassador for BenQ monitors and Hoya global ambassador for their filters. But that's sort of irrelevant tonight. I'm just proud to be associated with those brands. That I'm not paid ambassador, but they're brands that I used long before they invited me to become an ambassador. My first book, Mastering Long Exposure, the basis of tonight's talk, the definitive guide for photographers, covers quite an array. So, obviously, I'm not very good at the marketing part, but if you do like what you hear this evening, do please feel free to check it out. You can find it in Barnes and Noble, Amazon, all those sort of regular bookstores and things like that. It was co-published with National Geographic, so as a photographer, it's always a dream come true to work with such a preeminent global brand, for photography. So that was a dream come true for me as a photographer. My second book, Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Taking Better Photographs. It's a bit more of a sort of a gift kind of book, but we'll dip in and out of that. It covers a whole array of topics from the very, very basics all the way through into compositional techniques and tips and tricks and things like that. So as I say, I'll dip into that one. My third book was 52 Assignments, Travel Photography, which was the perfectly timed certainly for a European release in June 2020, when seemingly the entire world went down into a COVID lockdown and no one was traveling anywhere. So bless my publishers for that perfectly timed launch of a travel photography book. And then late last year, the 52 assignments, photographic exposure. For those who haven't seen them, they're all available in the US and Europe. The 52 assignments guide are quite fun. They're kind of gift books, so they're like $10, $12, something like that. But they are quite fun. There's a whole array. I've only done 2, obviously, but whatever genre of photography you like to pursue, black and white, landscape, street, whatever, there's an assignment a week. So if you find yourself in a bit of stuck in a rut or whatever, in a bit of an impasse, you need some inspiration to get out and shoot, or what to shoot, and they're quite good fun books to dip into and give you some inspiration and some ideas. As I say, contact information here, so yeah, please do feel free to check out my website. Lots of free goodies on there too. I'm going to jump straight in though to what is long exposure. I do have some text on my slides, don't worry, I'll kind of talk you through it anyway, so pretend we're not back at school or college or whatever. But I get asked this question so many times that, I teach a lot of private classes and group classes. And quite often I'm asked, what do I consider to be long exposure photography? And the first part, I break it down into 2 parts, and we'll talk about the first, or both parts this evening, but the first relatively quickly. And, the first part where we've got a shortage of available light. It's a long exposure because we need to enable the camera, allow the camera to gather in enough light to correctly expose the scene that we're trying to capture. We have no alternative. We have to have our camera mounted on a tripod to facilitate that, to enable the long shutter speed. And as I've written here, a long exposure is where we can't handhold the camera, really. We need to have it on a stable surface. And then the second part, we'll spend much more time, most of this presentation talking about the majority, where we choose to extend our shutter times and why do we do that? What effects do we get? And, that's the fun part of long exposure, what I consider to be, where we choose to do this. For creative purposes, we set out to, extend the shutter times and capture these images with a whole array of creative effects. And that's, the inspirational part of photography, where we set out to visualize something in our mind and then create it. So a much more fun side of it, I think. But, jumping straight in, astrophotography, where we have a shortage of available light. I live in London, obviously a very heavily light polluted city. So for me, it's a good 2.5-hour drive to get to the nearest sort of dark sky environment. I know there's some of you guys from Montana, so you're blessed with, and certainly, scattered around the US, you're blessed with lots of nice areas for the, without light pollution. But here, this is an image of the Milky Way rising over a land formation, a rock formation in the UK south coast in Dorset called Lulworth Cove. And this is actually a composite of 2 images. I do use Photoshop, I'm sure many of you do. I utilize it for the elements that I need. So where we have a broad dynamic range, for example, I don't put in flocks of birds and trees and things that aren't there. I like to keep the integrity of my images. But I do, use it, and I openly will, discuss when and where and that sort of thing. So in this particular image, where we've got a shortage of available light, we need to use a shutter speed of around 25 seconds as a max to capture the Milky Way, or the faint stars of the Milky Way. Now, 25 seconds is not sufficient time to gather in enough light for the foreground. So it is a composite. And the basis is that you don't take a photograph. If you take a photograph of the Milky Way when you've got a full moon, the moon is incredibly bright as a light source. Someone's scientifically worked out somehow that it's around 400,000 times dimmer than the sun, but still obviously incredibly bright. So if we've got a full moon, that's going to wash out the night sky and wash away the faint stars. So great for illuminating your scene, the foreground, the background, whatever, but not very good for the night sky. So if you're going to photograph Milky Way, take your images when there is a new moon or no moonlight at all. Accordingly, as I say, there's not sufficient light to illuminate the foreground, so you're going to have to use a long exposure. And I think this one was something like a minute and a half or maybe 2 minutes for the foreground and the landscape, and 25 seconds for the night sky. If you go beyond 25 seconds, then you start moving into light star trails, excuse me. And this is actually the cover of my book, Mastering Long Exposure, my first book. Now, star trails, these are taken a composite again of a number of images, about 150 or so images here. each one taken at 30 seconds long, all centered around the North Star, which is in the center of those concentric circles. This was actually taken in the middle of the Florida Everglades. I lived in the US for just over a decade, as I was saying to John, you know, a number of years in New York City, and then I moved down to just outside Miami. Now, this is sort of encapsulates, I think, a real essence of a long exposure photograph, because it has a bit of a wow factor. We get to reveal long periods of time to our audience and reveal things that they wouldn't ordinarily get to see. And I think that you'll find that your viewers find these kind of things quite exciting. What I was going to say really is that, you know, we know that we're inundated with beautiful images, and quite often you'll see photographs for, you know, Horseshoe Bend or the Grand Canyon or these stunning landscapes, and you know that the light is perfect, or, you know, you see someone's photograph from up in the Himalayas or something, you know, the light is beautiful. You know the effort as a photographer yourself that photographer's gone to go hiking, set up camp, wait for the perfect light, perfect cloud placement, capture this wonderful photograph, perhaps having to camp there for a few nights to get all those things to fall into place. And you look at it and you think, oh wow, that's, you know, stunning. And then you sort of click onto the next image, and then you see, you know, the I don't know, the sand dunes in wherever, the Sahara. And again, similarly, the effort that the photographer's gone to. But after a while, you're just looking after beautiful image after beautiful image, it can be a little bit sort of difficult to relate to these. And I think what you'll find is that it's the same, you know, if you're in a beautiful art gallery or in MoMA in New York City, you know, you walk around and you see all these wonderful paintings, but there's almost an overload of just too much to look at and absorb. But what I found, and it's something I talk a lot about in my Everything You Always Wanted to Know About Taking Better Photographs book, is that the human psyche really, really loves intrigue and mystery. We want to be asked questions by what we see. We want to ask questions ourselves by what we look at. You know, what are we looking at? Why? How did the photographer create this? What am I seeing here? You know, we can use other tips, you know, the compositional techniques, like here I've got a leading line of this bridge that's going over in the Everglades over towards the fishing hut there, that's a hunting hut or whatever, there's lightning shelter in the center of the image. But, you know, it's drawing your eye into the center of the image. We've got the concentric circles of the light trails themselves, all those sort of compositional techniques to keep your gaze within those four edges of the frame. And that, as a commercial or professional photographer, I use the word professional on the basis that this is how I make my living. My idea is really to keep your gaze, or my audience's gaze, within those four edges of my frame for as long as possible. And as I said at the beginning, you know, where you're taking images that are just pure beauty, I think that your audience can easily become detached from those and disassociated with those. But if you include something mysterious, something full of mystery or intrigue, then that draws your viewer in with those questions, and they stay looking at the image longer than they would. You know, I'm sure some of you take macro photos and you zoom into, you know, life size 1:1, 2:1, you know, beyond life size, with those minute details of objects, and you get to reveal that to your audience. We know these things are there, but we just don't ordinarily get to see them, and that really creates a bit of a wow factor and draws your viewer and your audience into your images. And equally so when you're doing some long exposures, as I say, condensing long periods of time into something two-dimensional that they can see. We all know the tides go in and out, we know clouds move, all these sort of things, but when you get to see them with your own eyes in a photograph, it really can draw you in. And also, don't forget, long exposures is the fun side of photography, on the basis that you get to really experience where you are. You're not just looking through the viewfinder all the time, snapping away. You're getting to step back and absorb where you are, the environment. You know, I'll never forget being where I was to take this photograph, walking over that rickety old bridge. I could see the eyes of the alligators and hear them in the water below. I parked up, there were hunters driving around, and I was this Brit driving an SUV parked up with a camera. I was the only one there without a rifle. You know, fireflies I'd never seen. You can see them on the right hand side there. You know, there's that whole essence of where you find yourself and really enjoying, you know, the environment where you are. But I go off point a little bit, to get back onto point. Where we've got a shortage of available light, these are the radio satellite dishes at Cambridge University here in the UK. You can see some light pollution there in the background, but if you can see the stars with the naked eye, our cameras are amazing tools. They're much more sensitive. So being able to gather in enough light here, having your camera on a stable tripod, locked on, using a remote release, taking a photograph every 30 seconds and capturing the rotation of the Earth. It's worth bearing in mind, that if you don't find yourself in the northern hemisphere, if you would find yourself towards this is the celestial equator. So this is in Montenegro in Central Europe. You won't get concentric circles. You get a much more linear sort of form of the star trails, because you're sort of almost equidistant between the two pole stars as such. So a lot more of a sort of vertical lines, as you can see here in front of you in that image. But something I wanted to say about the star trails is this is a beautiful old castle, and we're fortunate to have a lot of these in the UK, called Bodiam Castle. Now, if you imagine this image without the star trails in it at all, it was quite a pretty picturesque castle with nice reflections and, the way that I've put it, and composition and that kind of thing, beautiful kind of scene that I managed to capture. But a lot of the essence of what I'm going to talk about this evening, the long exposure techniques, are to bear in mind that they are techniques, and that, think of it that you've got a photographic tool belt, toolkit, whatever, and you can dip in and out of these when you need to. So including the star trails in this particular image adds another layer of interest in your image. I think this would have been a very picturesque kind of image without the star trails, but including them. It's not all about star trails, but they're just part and parcel, part of an image that make up a bigger picture that, creates a bit more interest to your audience. And that's the way that you got to see your photographs, is that what am I going to put in and where and how, and what am I going to build up layer upon layer. And we'll talk about, additional kind of techniques and how to do this, further along in the presentation. So that's astrophotography. Night photography. The blue hour, that fantastic time. Obviously, it's an hour before the sun rises, but I'm talking about in the evening, so the hour or so that just after the sun sets. Here, the Elizabeth Clock Tower, or Big Ben, as it's popularly known here in central London, it's a fantastic time to photograph. You've got, the sun's gone down, you've still got sufficient ambient light in the sky to illuminate your scene. You can still see the lovely detail in the clouds, but the artificial lights have come on as well. So there's that electricity of that urban environment. It doesn't always have to be urban, but, obviously street lamps and on the freeways and that kind of thing, or small towns. But that combination of artificial lights together with the blue hour and, ambient light from the blue hour is a lovely time to photograph. Really helps your subjects pop off your screen, off your photographs. And I know we're moving into the sort of winter season for a lot of us, certainly here in the UK, but normally you'll find that the winds die down a little bit in the evening. So the blue hour, lovely time here in Amsterdam to get the reflections of the water, and there's still got sufficient ambient light there for the movement of the clouds in the sky. So beautiful time to use your long exposures here. It will flatten out water and blur the skies using long shutter speeds here over St. Paul's Cathedral. We'll talk about neutral density filters later on, and how to get those effects during the day. But long periods of time enables you to get these pronounced effects. Another castle, this one's in North Wales, called Conwy Castle. But as I say, the blue hour, sometimes we don't have any cloud information in the sky. There's no cloud there at all. Some photographers, quite purists, perhaps, say, well, I'm going to pack up and go home and not bother. But, I think that it's still a fantastic time to photograph. It really helps your subject pop off the screen and, really draws your eye into the subject there. So the sodium lamps that are illuminating this old castle really stands out, that strong yellow hues, with no sort of nothing to confuse the viewer, confuse your eye when looking at it. So, almost cut out of with a blue sky environment. But then sometimes you do have, lovely cloud formations here looking at Key Biscayne from in Miami, and one of the bridges over into downtown Miami. Lovely place to photograph. A wonderful sort of urban architecture there. I love primarily an architectural photographer, loving geometric shapes and, you know, the urban environment as well. But again, you know, combination there with all the yellows and greens from all the different light sources, together with the blue owl and the cloud formations above. Going back to London again, you know, the clock tower here, this is not quite the blue hour. As you can see, there's still red in the sky, so the sun's literally just set and it's not had a chance to move on to that next period of time. But I wanted to talk about exposure very quickly. Very, very important to control your exposure when you're photographing at night, certainly with long exposures. If I had just not paid careful attention, it's very easy to overexpose all the highlights in your image. And here, the clock face, you know, for me, it was or clock faces, I should say. For me, it's very, very important to pay careful attention to elements that are going to overexpose. Obviously, you want things incredibly sharp and you're focusing to be spot on, but also your exposure. If there were two white blobs there of just overexposed information, this image would just fall away and just wouldn't work. So it's very, very important, especially when you start talking in the realms of seconds, you know, 5 seconds here, 10 seconds there, when you're taking photographs at blue hour and at night. You know, it can be very easy to lose sight of your highlights and overexpose those and end up with images with no salvageable data there. So do pay careful attention. But just because the blue hour passes as well and moves into the sort of inky black skies, don't give up shooting. You know, I still think that you can capture some wonderful images just after the blue hour here back in Amsterdam. But I'm going to dwell here on this image, which is under the Rickenbacker Causeway in Miami, linking again Key Biscayne to downtown Miami. And I was fortunate to live for nearly 6 years or so, 7 years, in just outside Miami. And I've driven under this underpass and to get over so many times, and deliberated about getting out of the car. Not the safest environment to be jumping out, parking up, setting up tripods and expensive camera gear. But one evening I just thought I really have to risk it really and get this shot. So, and I'm so glad that I did. It's probably the fastest or the first time I've ever really willed time to travel incredibly quickly when I was taking a long exposure, really sort of trying to keep one eye on all directions over my shoulder, etc. But really trying to will time on. But this is one of those images that obviously we can see the starburst effect or aperture spike effect in the center there from that street light. And for those who don't know how to create this effect, it's a very, very simple technique, and it's just shooting with a small or a narrow aperture. So f16, f18 at a push forces the light through the aperture blades in your lens, and depending on how many aperture blades that you have with such a small aperture hole opening, it creates this starburst effect. Now, I knew the technique would obviously happen. So in this particular image, I knew that I would be shooting with f16 because f16, I wanted a deep depth of field. Now, I've put a vignette, a darkening down of the upper elements of this image, which is technically my foreground. There's no foreground element at the bottom because it's just, you know, the reflections of water. But what I wanted was every bit of concrete under that flyover to be in really sharp focus right at the top center of the screen. Then the mid-ground, the mid-elements, which is those blue pillars in the center of the image, I wanted that all in sharp focus. And then obviously the lights of the skyscrapers in the background of Miami itself, the background, wanting that in sharp focus too. So a deep depth of field led me to have to shoot with f16 or f18. I think this was f16. Now I knew a byproduct of that would be to create this aperture spike. Now, this is one of those times where you have to kind of slow down a little bit and think about your composition. And I could see these street lights from the flyover, the upper right one, that as the way that we're looking into this image. So it was one of those situations where careful consideration of where I place my camera and my tripod, moving a few paces over to the left side to centralize those street lamps, knowing in my mind that shooting at f16 would create this very bright starburst effect, and I could utilize these to have a center focal point in the image to draw your eye into that brightest area, that brightest part. Now, there's lots of leading lines here. We've got the underneath of the underpass with those structures all drawing your eye in from the top. Even those vertical pillars, the blues and purples, are all guiding your eye into the center towards that aperture spike. So drawing your eye into the center of the image again, compositionally, to retain your gaze a little bit longer than you would ordinarily see. So worth knowing that how to include this sort of technique. Now, sometimes you don't need to shoot at f16. Now, this is a very popular scene. This is called the London Eye in central London along the River Thames. It's it's a Ferris wheel, so it's a big tourist icon place, and it's photographed at least hundreds and hundreds of times a day. Tourists walking past, Instagramming it, whatever. Now, it's something that I talk about in my third book, The 52 Assignments Travel, and it's all about inspirational ideas when you're somewhere that's not home, whether it's traveling in the US, within the US, or abroad, or whatever. Now, it's a very good practice to push yourself as a photographer, and it's something I do regularly, which is try to take photographs of popular places or places that you photograph regularly in a very, very different way, so that you're thinking outside the box. You're trying to think about how you're going to photograph these slightly differently. Now, a scene like this, as I say, it's photographed thousands of times a day. How can I photograph it a little bit different to put my unique spin on it? It's, as I say, very good practice, whether you choose a different lens than you would ordinarily, angle of view, time of day, weather, or whatever, thinking about how you're going to photograph a scene. Now, what I chose to do in this particular image, it was an August, so we have a harvest moon, which is the brightest moon, full moon of the year for us in the UK. So you can see the full moon there on the right-hand side. Yes, it's an overexposed big white blob. Now, the moon, as I said earlier, is very, very bright. I'm shooting with a 16mm lens here and a full frame camera, so I was never going to be zoomed in on the moon. That wasn't the idea of this image, but it wasn't going to be possible to have any kind of contrast or surface information on the moon, even some shadow detail, because I would have to have used such a fast shutter speed. I wouldn't have gathered enough light to illuminate the scene. The dynamic range there would be so broad. So I knew that the moon was going to be overexposed. Now, I could have repositioned compositionally, but I didn't want to. I quite like the architecture that was on that side of the London Eye Ferris wheel. So I chose in this case to shoot with f16, deliberately to create that aperture spike around the moon, something a little bit different, a little bit more unique. There's no foreground interest because, again, the river there is just blurred. I knew that I was deliberately trying to blur to get that color, reflections from all the buildings and the wheel itself opposite. Now, I also didn't have any depth of field issues here because for those who don't know, the building in blue behind in the center of the wheel is, is probably a good 800 meters or so away from, at least from that, from the London Eye. So there is a big distance there, half a mile or whatever. But from a camera's point of view, everything is pretty much on the same plane of focus. Everything is compacted together, so there's no real depth of field issue. I didn't need to shoot with a deep depth of field in mind. What I did is, as I say, chose to put the camera into f16. I don't go beyond f16 or f18 at a push. You have to be very careful when you do that, because you'll start moving into the realms of diffraction, and diffraction can lead to very soft images. So just because your lens goes to f29 or beyond, don't feel I wouldn't ever go, as I say, to those sort of narrow apertures, because you will lose what you gather in depth of field. You will lose in sharpness. So, and I've never really found depth of field wise. I've struggled beyond f18 anyway, and needed to go beyond that. So anyway, going back on point, needing to have my camera on a stable tripod to gather insufficient light, to deliberately choose to shoot this at f16 to create something a little bit different. Moving on though, here a picture of Old Town Havana in Havana, Cuba. Wonderful, 1950s classic American cars around. Now, in this particular image, well, straight off the bat, you can see aperture spikes, slightly different lens, which is why they're flared out and not so prominent, perhaps. But again, depth of field, I wanted to make sure the bits of the roadway in the bottom of the image all the way through into the distance were in sharp focus. So f16 was a necessity there. But I've included this image for a couple of reasons. And the first is talking about a tripod. We need to use a tripod to have our camera stable enough. There's some places, yes, sure, you can put the camera on the floor or on a camera bag on the floor or whatever, but really that's not going to help you compositionally. And if you're talking about taking long exposures and you know, gathering in a lot of light, you don't want to risk your camera moving, and you know, you just want an easy life. So if you haven't invested in a tripod, I really do recommend a lightweight carbon fiber tripod. I've taught so many classes with so many students that turn up with gigantic, you know, wrought iron tripods that will withstand hurricane force winds, but you know, weigh, you know, I don't know, 20 kilos or whatever, 10 kilos or whatever it is, and they just begrudge carrying this thing around. It's just too heavy. They'll leave it in the trunk of the car in the hotel room or whatever. There's no point having that. You know, it's fine if you're in a studio and you're not moving it, but if you're going to be out and about taking long exposures, then get a lightweight, compact, strong tripod that's, you know, as I say, carbon fiber is probably the way to go. I have it in the side of my backpack wherever I go, and I can throw it up really quickly, grab the shot, pack it up, move on. Wouldn't be possible to get this shot with, you know, handheld. But more importantly, is talking about raw files, raw formats. Hopefully all of you shoot with raw. Now, I think it's very, very important. You know, there's nothing wrong with shooting JPEGs as well. Sometimes you just want to document where you are, or have a low res image, or you know, something you can email on to friends or family or whatever it may be. But do capture the raw files as well. And this is one of those good examples of why you should. We can see the classic car, lots of different light sources. We've got a very strong blue light coming in from the right-hand side from an old fluorescent tube lamp, illuminating the side of that car on the roadway there with its blue hues. We can see the strong yellow hues there with the sodium lamps. And then off in the distance is actually another weirdly blue LED light that I've slightly overexposed, but it's sort of irrelevant really. But what I wanted to say was our cameras are amazing tools. They have the ability to capture all the different colors of light, but they can easily get confused. The white balance meters, you know, raw files will capture all of that information and enable you to color correct your images in post-production. The JPEGs, once the information there, it's embedded permanently in that file, and your camera it's a tool. It doesn't know what it's photographing. It doesn't know, you know, what the scene is. It will try to color correct things the way that it's been programmed. But do bear in mind, you know, your computer power at home, your MacBook Pros, or whatever you're using, are so much more powerful than the tiny little computer inside your camera, which is what a JPEG has been programmed by some technicians in a Nikon factory or lab, or, you know, or Canon or whatever. So you want to be able to add the amount of contrast and sharpness and all saturation and those sort of things on your images, and not leave that to other people that haven't really, you know, don't know what you're photographing. Now, in this particular case, my camera, when it saw this image, now this is post-production, but it saw those blue hues coming out from that fluorescent tube lamp and tried to neutralize those. And then it saw the yellows and it tried to neutralize those. So the colors were going a little bit crazy. So this is actually what my camera, it's a Canon DSLR, and you can see very, very different. It's neutralized that blue hue into you know, sort of a correct tonality, but it's made the sky go magenta rather than blue. It's tried to neutralize those yellows and make them orange. So it's very, very ugly compared to the color corrected version. This is what it looked like with my eyes. There's no point neutralizing the blues, because that is what the scene looked like. So bear in mind that, you know, your camera is going to try to color correct things, but ultimately as a photographer you want complete control. And that's why I do recommend that scenes like this, if you had taken this image as a JPEG, you would be stuck with what you captured at the time. Now, auto white balance can do some fabulous things too, but it's not flawless. This image of central London, the top horizontal strip is a color corrected version. You know, we've got the shade on the left, or cloudy, also white balance there, or preset white balance, just to say, very strong yellow hues. We've got the tungstens on the right, very, very strong blue hues. Again, this is a color corrected version of what's called the Millennium Bridge, because it was built, you know, for the opening of the change of the millennium. Now, for those of you who rely on your auto white balance, you know, you can see the color corrected. This is the same image I just showed you in a smaller form in the top left there, where it says color corrected. Now, this is for my Canon camera. Auto white balance in the center top is still quite orangey yellow. Now, interestingly, fluorescent in the bottom right hand corner there is probably the closest to the most color accurate version of the image. And if you were just shooting JPEG, would you necessarily have thought, oh, I'm going to shoot with fluorescent because that reflects really what I see, unless you're checking out in the field. So leaving it on auto white balance is not necessarily, you know, the right thing to do, or putting it into some of the other effects. So do bear in mind that they don't always correlate to the particular scene. Auto white balance, though, is easy to leave on if you're shooting raw, because then you can just fix it. It captures all that data for you. But again, looking over the rooftops in, you know, Midtown Manhattan, lots of greens and oranges and artificial lights and sources there to contend with. So relying on auto white balance. But also sometimes you may want to put filters, you know, and effects on your images too. Here, this is the Lloyd's building in London, and it's sometimes referred to as the Inside Out building. But, you know, having a color accurate rendition of your image first before you start making, you know, I wanted to add the blue tones to make it look a little bit more futuristic. But it's very, very important for me to have everything exactly how it should be first before I start adding in any other sort of tonality and changing my images in post-production. Not that I do that often, but sometimes, you know, it's fun to sort of play around, but do bear that in mind. But, you know, I've digressed very, very steeply from the you know, on point here. If you're taking pictures at the Louvre in Paris, getting lovely reflections, night photos, the night time is a lovely time to photograph. All the tourists have gone home. It's like having these locations back to yourself, having your camera mounted on a tripod. Not possible to take these sorts of images handheld. You really do need to allow your camera sufficient time to gather in enough ambient light there to illuminate your scene correctly, to get the correct exposure. Whether you're wandering around, this is along the River Thames. I love architecture. I love being out in our city at night, or most cities, to be honest. So you get a lovely sense of mood and feeling with night photos. But you can also convert your photos. This looks a bit like infrared, but it's underneath the Eiffel Tower. But this was actually taken at night, just converted into a high contrast black and white image. So don't forget black and white images here. The Tower of London, you know, just because there is a whole vibrancy and a plethora of color around when you're taking photographs at night, do consider converting them into black and white. So they still create these wonderful high contrast images. But again, color, it does have that sort of extra pop too, you know, whether it's illuminated church windows, neon signs, you get a lovely sort of graduation of light that creates a sense of sort of three dimensions to your images, and a sense of feeling and an essence of place, and, you know, back to that intrigue and mystery and questions. But again, it's not possible to take these images handheld. You really do need to have your camera on a stable surface, stable tripod. For the landscape photographers amongst yourselves, you know, we know that when the sky is just cloudy and not very interesting, don't include it, and that works the same for night photography too. This is a photograph in Paris, very uninteresting, boring sky, so I just cut it out, zoomed in on some of the architecture there, so really sort of draw your eye into the scene rather than be distracted by a really sort of strip of ugly sky in the image. Midtown Manhattan, obviously, I normally tell, you know, a lot of European club members and British club members, you know, how exciting it is to be in Manhattan, and it's like walking through a, you know, cinematic experience of being in a movie set at every street corner. But again, it really is, you know, being able to set up your tripod very quickly, get those images that you like. If you like cinematic style photographs, capture those long exposures, pack up, move on. You know, it's a wonderful place to move around. But again, you know, thinking outside the box, this is quite a popular location of what is our Houses of Parliament at Big Ben and Westminster Bridge. Thinking about composition is important. You know, it's easy to get carried away, as I said earlier, you know, about being out at night and the excitement of being able to capture images at night, and excuse me, you know, not really paying close attention to your images and composition. You know, composition is still very important. Just because you're getting a good exposure or, you know, a nice scene, think about making compelling images for your audience, and also ones that are a little bit different. I'm just going to talk very, very quickly about histograms and why I personally don't use them. We can see very, very bright light sources. These street lamps on this bridge, you can see the aperture spikes, so we know straight off the bat, again, you know, deep depth of field, having the wall in focus, the bridge in focus, and then the clock tower there, Big Ben, and the buildings in the distance in sharp focus. So deep depth of field, f16. Now, the street lamps on those bridges are in threes, they're sort of sets of three, which is why there's so many aperture spikes, because each lamp is creating, you know, quite a lot together. Now, for me, it's very, very important as a, you know, a photographer or a commercial photographer or whatever, to make sure that the highlights are not overexposed. Now, we can see clearly that those street lamps are overexposed in the center. Now, for me, what is more important, and the main part of this image, is the clock face on Big Ben. Now, if I were able to zoom in, this is a keynote presentation, which you can't, but you should be able to see hopefully some numbers and certainly the hands of the clock face. If I zoomed in, you would be able to read the time and see or read those numbers. Now, that was the most important thing, to not overexpose that clock face. If I was using a histogram, or relying on a histogram, I should say, really. Now, a histogram, for those who don't know, is like an X and Y axis, a bar chart, as you say. From the far left-hand side is all the black tones in your image, pure blacks, and pure blacks have no information there, it's just pure black color. You cannot recover any data there. Throughout all the tonality in the midtones, all the way up to the brighter tones, and on the far right-hand side of your bar chart, so to speak, is the pure whites. And again, pure white is overexposed, pure black is underexposed, and you cannot recover any information there. So that pure white in the center of those street lamps on the bridge is overexposed. There's no way of recovering the data there to reveal, you know, the little filaments that would have been in that street lamp. But to me, that doesn't matter. Now, if I was looking at a histogram of this image, you would see a very sharp spike on the right-hand side where there is pure white. And if you were relying on that histogram for a perfect exposure, you would say to yourself, well, I've overexposed something in this image, something's wrong, I need to find out what that is and fix it. Now, what I do is I use what's called a highlight priority warning. And what that is on the back of the camera. It's just a setting. Most DSLRs, most mirrorless, whatever, have this facility. And what that would do is when you review your image on the back of the screen, it will flash anything that is pure black or pure white, so purely underexposed or purely overexposed. Now, when I'm out in the field and I've taken this image and it's been, you know, 45, 55 seconds, something like that, I want to make sure that the clock face is not overexposed. Now, sure, I could zoom in and check that. But if I've got the highlight priority warning, just reviewing the image, I can see straight away that the clock face isn't flashing, and therefore I know that it's not overexposed. I can see what's flashing, it's the street lamps, and I'm not worried about that. So I can pack up and move on to the next image. I don't have to waste time taking another image. If I was just relying on the histogram, I'd have to zoom in 100% on my camera screen, waste time looking around with a little joystick to find out, which bit did I overexpose? Did I overexpose the important bits? And while I'm doing that, the light's changing, I'm losing good light or whatever. So worth bearing in mind, you know, using histograms or not using them in this case. And also bear in mind that, you know, I shoot RAW only. I don't really shoot JPEGs personally. But if you're shooting, if you're looking at a histogram is only for a JPEG version of your image, whether or not you're shooting RAW. So if I look at the histogram on my camera, it's only showing me a histogram for a JPEG that I'm not actually taking or keeping, or seeing. So bear that in mind. But heading back on point, this is back in Miami. If you'd like to take these sort of wide angle panoramic shots, this is about 5 or 6 images stitched together in a vertical, you know, portrait mode position. As long as you take these images relatively back to back, Photoshop has an amazing ability to stitch these together. The algorithms are fantastic. So, you know, there's no reason to not take panoramic wide angle shots. Just because you're photographing at night. Just bear in mind that give Photoshop some help. So take the photographs with a good 40 or 50% overlap between the images so that it has a lot of information there to be able to stitch everything together nice and easily. You know, don't just leave such a tiny overlap, that because Photoshop will struggle. So, you know, data is cheap, data storage is cheap, whatever. So just take lots of images and overlap them by a good 40%. And then finally, the image that caught me out, nearly caught me out, I should say, was our blue. We have these wonderful bluebells and a forest early one morning. I thought that light would reflect around the mist and fog early in the morning, but actually light is absorbed by mist and fog very, very rapidly. As when you think about it, obviously when you're driving through fog, you can't see very far through it with your car headlights. So having a tripod, having the ability to set the camera up very, very quickly, get the composition I want, which is the benefit of having a tripod and not putting my camera or my camera bag on a damp, dewy kind of wood floor in the forest. But yeah, having it with me so that I could set up, get the shot that I need. I wasn't able to handhold these shots without boosting the ISO, and then I'm going to end up with resulting noisy images. And then finally, the last part that I want to talk about very, very quickly, where we have a shortage of available light, is interiors. Here, this grand staircase in an old hotel in central London. Yes, there's some artificial lights inside. They were very, very low light environment, though. They were more sort of ornamental rather than really sort of letting in much light. So camera needed to be on a tripod to gather in enough light. There is a caveat here, though, the stained glass windows. Using a long exposure to gather in enough light there to illuminate the scene did result in overexposing those windows. So I did have to take a second shot with a much faster shutter speed, purely so that the camera's not moving, it's been on a tripod. So I was able to just use a layer mask in Photoshop and just paint back in a bit of the lead work so that, the overexposure's corrected. Otherwise, I was just going to have 6 big white blobs in the image, and that wouldn't have been very appealing. We have these beautiful ornate ceilings in cathedrals and churches around the UK. So do pay careful attention. This was actually done in camera, so making sure that I didn't overexpose the stained glass windows, and then just opened up the shadows in post-production. Do look up and around. It's very common, certainly if you find yourself coming over to Europe for a vacation or whatever, it's easy to forget to look up in some of these old buildings, and they have the most beautifully ornate ceilings. So do have a look, especially if you've got a camera on a tripod, which you'll need and quite often in these low light environments. If you've got a flip out screen, it's a bonus. If you're trying to create these symmetrical images, it makes life a bit easier than breaking your neck or your back trying to lie on the floor and look around and that kind of thing. But do pay attention to the ornate ceilings, which we have in a lot of European buildings. If like me, you like walking around tower, we call them tower blocks, big apartment buildings, like brutalist concrete structures, you do get wonderful light that comes up through these stairwells and down along corridors and outside apartments. So, really can gather in lovely long exposures there to get a real sense of mood and create these interesting images. And then finally, my favorite image from my trip to Cuba, obviously it's subjective, but this was my favorite. And this is one of those times where just having your tripod with you facilitated and enabled me to gather the shot that I wanted to capture. I was walking down the street. I don't really speak Spanish, unfortunately, but was trying to use a long lens to take a picture of this beautiful classic car. I think it's a Cadillac. No, I'm not sure. I'm not even going to guess because someone's going to correct me. But I was welcomed into this, what was actually a car park. It looked like a bombed out basement, but this wonderful car sitting there. And having the ability to set up the tripod, get the composition I wanted, get in enough light, and end up with a favorite image for me personally under this old strobe light or tube light, wouldn't have been possible to do this handheld. So having the tripod there, easy to set up, being very, very quick, and then move on. But that's enough, I'll say, about tripods. Now, that was probably longer than I anticipated, talking about the first part, where we have no alternative than to use long exposure to gather in enough light in those different environments there to what are long exposures, but ultimately not because we choose to. Now, the remainder of tonight I'm going to talk about is where we now choose creatively to extend the shutter times. Why do we do this? For a number of reasons, and I'm going to jump straight into blur and how we use different kinds of blur creatively. Now, bear with me on this, because there's more types of blur than you think about at the moment. Here, I've written at the bottom, the camera and the subject are moving. Now, intentional camera movement, or ICM, you might have seen quite a lot of this, is a very sort of on-trend photographic topic at the moment, your subject, you'll find it's all over Instagram. There's a lot of photographers, doing this genre of photography. Now, I like it, and I'll talk about it, and that's kind of what this is. But I think there's a sort of British expression to pinch of salt with that, like bear in mind that there's a certain way to do it, I think, that works well, and there's a certain way that doesn't work so well. And obviously it's subjective, but this is just my thoughts on it. But there's a little story here behind this image. I'm from London originally. I'm back here now, but as I said, I lived for a little over a decade in the east coast of the US, and I was fortunate to live just in Fort Lauderdale, just outside Miami, and have the beach very, very close to where I lived. And it was such a stunning beach and coastline, and I was so fortunate to have it there. And I tried as a city dweller, to make the most of having that as much as I could, to go down. And one evening I was there with all my camera gear, and it really stuck in my mind, because it was one of those times when for some reason, and it never happened before, it never happened subsequently, there was literally, as far as the eye could see, not another human. I'd never seen it like that before, and as I say, never again. But it was like a private beach. The sun was just setting, or just had set. The beautiful golden light you can see on the sand there, the purple hues, the turquoise water, and not a soul in sight. It was magical, really. And I thought to myself, what I want to do is capture where I am, but not only where I am, but how I'm feeling. Now, quite often, when I'm teaching classes, my first go-to question to myself and what I teach is, what am I photographing and why? They're the questions I ask myself. Why am I pushing the shutter button? Am I just taking a picture of my dog or my nephew or my wife or whatever? That's fine. Am I documenting the view out my hotel room? That's awesome too. But sometimes, or quite often, you want to photograph something that has a bit more substance to it, a bit more meaning for other people, and then conveying an essence of, a message of some sort. Now, in this particular image, I wanted to capture the feeling of serenity and tranquility and peace. And I thought, right, I could use a fast shutter speed, and I could freeze motion, and I could freeze every droplet of water. Hopefully everyone can, discern and see from this image that it's the water rushing up the shoreline at the beach. Now, if I used a fast shutter speed and froze it a moment in time, that's all good and well, but it wouldn't convey a feeling of serenity. A long exposure, dreamy, like abstract, painterly feel is what I wanted to create in this image. So I used as slow shutter speed as I could get away with for this particular image to capture a nice dreamy, dreamlike ethereal feeling for the movement of the water, to convey the feeling of how I was, where I sat, where I found myself. Equally, same beach, very different time of day, very different lens. I was using a very long lens. I think this is a 300mm, if I recall. Zoomed into the formation of the waves and moving the camera ever so gently in this case, and just creating a nice painterly effect, creating something much more abstract than you would see if you'd frozen motion. It's compressed, so because it's a long lens, only the slightest bit of movement is accentuated, so it creates a sort of lovely painterly effect. Now, carrying on with the intentional camera movement, that's where I should say, sorry, if I go back, the camera and the subject are moving here. The wave is moving and the camera is moving at the same time. This image here it was taken in Times Square in Midtown Manhattan. I'm sure most of you've been, but I normally have to explain this to a UK audience of what a chaotic place this can be. Full of tourists and honking horns and sirens and noise and TV screens and blaring music and whatever. Now, this cab had stopped at a crosswalk. Now, I could have taken a photograph of 1/200th of a second or whatever it would have been to freeze motion and taken a picture of what I could see. Now, that wouldn't really convey much of any interest. It would have been a documentary photo. If this is a Ford Crown Victoria, I think they are, taxi stopped at a crosswalk in Times Square, whatever, I may as well use my phone. I wanted to convey a sense of energy and emotion and feeling and chaos of how I felt while I was there. I lived in Manhattan for quite a number of years and only actually went into Times Square 3 times, once by accident, once to see it for myself, and once with taking some family friends to see it who adamantly wanted to go. It was a place that if you live in the city, you kind of avoid, really. but it's because it is so chaotic, and I wanted to convey that sense of chaos with a camera. So in this case, the subject isn't moving as it was in the previous case, but I've deliberately moved the camera. So I've intentionally moved the camera, that intentional camera movement that you hear referred to, or ICM, to create a sense of chaos. And you can see the angles I've moved. Now, I think when you're doing this, less is more, and that's very, very important. You can still see what you're looking at. You can still read the word taxi. I've moved the camera so gently. You can see in the top left corner, I think that was an M&M shop, store or whatever, but that's not too relevant. But what I mean is that you can still see the subject that you're looking at. A lot of intentional camera movement starts moving into these sort of very abstract images. And I took this earlier in the year of some spring foliage on a tree, just for this presentation, really, just to show that heavy-handed moving the camera around with a long shutter in the daytime creates this very abstract image. But it's so abstract that you wouldn't have a clue what you're looking at. It looks like I've just created this thing in Photoshop, and each to their own. Some people might think, oh, that's really nice, but to me, it doesn't hit the sort of senses of what am I looking at and enjoy looking at. I think it's much more enjoyable to take an image where you can actually understand. So if you're taking intentional camera movement, I do think less is more. Don't be too heavy-handed. You can still use blur creatively to capture this sort of sense of feeling in your image, rather than just creating something so sort of abstract that you don't know what you're looking at. Have a little play though. It is quite a fun technique to move the camera slightly and get these sort of interesting effects, whether it's architecture. Quite often you'll see it's beach scenes. This was another image I took actually for mastering long exposure, my book. Bit of a fun project there, really. I wanted to utilize long exposures to create these different effects. So set my tripod up. My tripod, like most, have a little catch at the top of the legs, which enable you to get your camera to a lower point on the ground. You can open the legs a little bit wider than you would ordinarily, and that can be useful when you're setting up, for example, here. So I had two of the tripod legs, two along on the back, touching the doors, and one in the footwell. Camera mounted on the tripod, pre-focused on the car dashboard and all the insides. Turned off autofocus, set the camera into 30-second exposures. On drive mode, so as soon as it's taking one image, it's taking another and then another. Now I use a wired remote remote control. I just prefer those because it's just one less set of batteries I ever have to worry about running out and leaving me stranded. So wired remote, triggered the shutter, drive mode, every 30 seconds it's taking one image after another. I think this was on about F8 or F11, something like that. And then just drove around. I was outside Fort Lauderdale, driving through the city, just driving down the highway, up the interstate I-95 for a little bit, capturing image after image. And then when you get back into post, you can kind of choose the images that you like as you're driving around. So as I've written here, the camera and part of the subject, the part being the outside part is moving, the inside obviously stays focused. So quite a fun technique there to consider using this kind of blur. Now, if you're moving, if part of your subject's moving, it's always useful to have that anchored in with part of the subject that's not. So if you have a juxtaposition of something that's moving, something that's really locked in and anchoring that movement, it really helps accentuate movement. So here we have, back at the fair, the big wheel wanting to capture, the sense of feeling where you are, the kids screaming, enjoying the rides, the music, the light show, a bit more chaos. But again, if I'd use the fast shutter speed to freeze motion, you wouldn't capture the sense of movement at all, or the light show. So using the long exposure, but anchoring it in with the, not even sure what that ride is called on the right hand side there. But again, choosing to use f16 to get some little aperture spikes, which if you zoom in, you can kind of see. This is a subway shot taken at the subways in Stockholm in Sweden. A beautiful city. If you ever get the opportunity to visit, I certainly recommend it. And their subway system is awesome. It's really underutilized, over-resourced. You can set up, it's so clean, especially compared to the New York's metro. I wanted to capture an image of a train blurred as it rushes into the station. Now, there were lots of big bright strobe lights, as you can see on the wall opposite, so I was quite limited in the amount of a long exposure. I think I could get away with just, second and a half of time, something like that, with a polarizing filter on the camera. We'll talk about polarizers and neutral densities a bit later, but set up the camera on a tripod, bulb mode. So bulb mode is I trigger the shutter where push the button, remote release to trigger the shutter, and then push the button again to close it. So I have much more control over the timings there. Now, just as I could hear the train coming, these two ladies walked into the scene, stood very, very still, actually. And I was very lucky that they stood so still, because if they turned to talk to one another and walked up and down the platform, they would have been captured as a very sort of ghostly blur. And they stood incredibly still. And so I'm just going to turn the heating down off. So it was an amazing opportunity there to, you know, they kindly positioned themselves for me in on the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds, for those who don't know, is where you divide your image up into 9 equal segments, and then if you're stuck compositionally, you can position various elements on those sort of junction points, you know, where those 2 points meet. So here they're on a vertical rule of third there. So they still, you know, added a human dimension to this image, worth bearing in mind. And then again, just trigger the shutter just before the train entered into the scene, captured the shot for as long as I could. I'd already taken a test exposure shot, so I knew how long I could get away with for that particular image, and created something a little bit different. And this is another one of those kind of images where you're capturing something different, a little bit more unique, back to, you know, thinking outside the box. In my 52 assignments travel book, I say, you know, take that location shot, but create your alternative landmark shots. You know, it's great to capture where you know, when you're on your holiday somewhere, but think outside the box to create something a little bit unique. And here we've got a double-decker bus, so 2-story bus that drives past, light trails guiding your eye in. So it's a leading line. You look into the image here as if you're reading a book, entering in from the left-hand side, following those bright light trails towards the clock tower, which is exactly where I want your eye to then stay and focus. Now, if I had captured this bus and the movement of this bus, I should say, all the way through the image. So your eyes would enter in the left-hand side, follow those bright light trails, and then exit in the bottom right-hand corner. And it would lose the effect because your gaze, as quickly as it enters into the image, would exit too, and you would be subconsciously ready to look to the next image, and you wouldn't stop and look at the clock tower. So it was very, very important to make sure that this image, that the light trails stopped in the right place. Now, for those who want to, you know, this is an educational presentation. The whole point here is to show you, I'll show you some images that certainly don't work too, but in this case, if you want to replicate this, what I strongly recommend, and how I did it, is actually to do it the other way around. Now, the buses, obviously we drive on a different side of the road here in the UK, so the bus is actually coming toward me from the right-hand side. So what I've done is I've triggered the shutter. I've used bulb mode again. So bulb mode, for those who don't know, is you dial in your ISO, you dial in your aperture, and you just use your remote release to open and close the shutter. You don't preset any time there. So I have a lot more flexibility of when to trigger and when to close the shutter. I don't have, if the bus accelerates and goes very fast or very slow, I've got much more control, rather than suddenly having 5 or 10 seconds left over the exposure time that I've ruined the shot. It's, for example, you know, overexposing. So as the bus approached from the right-hand side coming towards me, just before it got to the clock tower, I triggered the shutter, and then as it exited, the image closed the shutter, and that way I had much more control over where the visually, as it looks, you know, where the light trails start and where they stop. So worth bearing in mind. But it's a fantastic technique to utilize, so to, you know, really guide your audience around, but create a strong image, something unique, you know, and something different. Big Ben, the clock tower here in the UK, is photographed ridiculous amounts of time. So how can I create something different, more unique as a photographer, you know, utilize blurs, or one of the blurs. Now, I'd be amiss if I didn't talk to you very quickly. I know, please bear with me. I know I'm talking about a lot of different types of blur, but there are, you know, I think they're very useful to know in your photographic toolkit. Panning is a very important technique. Back in Cuba here, so these fantastic cars are whizzing around, and you know, I could use a fast shutter speed to capture this classic car as it's driving down the road and freeze time. But that's not what I wanted to convey, because there's actually all the architecture there. There's actually someone in a red shirt behind the car, someone sitting in a doorway there on the right-hand side. There are other pedestrians. If I'd used a very fast shutter speed, I would have frozen that moment in time, but I would have frozen the whole scene. So that would have frozen all the roadway in the foreground, all the architecture in the back, and the car everything would have just looked as if the car was parked and not moving. And that's not what I wanted to convey here. I wanted to convey that this thing was driving at 50, 60 miles an hour down this big boulevard, and this thing is working in great form, working well. So using a slow shutter speed, I was able to convey a sense of movement there. Now, it could be a bit of a tricky technique, panning, if you're just trying this. And there's a few tips I can recommend that work very, very well when I'm teaching this out in the field with students. The first is the main reason, the way to do it really, I find, is have your camera on drive mode. So you're holding down the shutter button, it's taking image after image after image, as fast as your camera, will enable you. If you've got a Canon R5 or whatever, you're taking 20 frames a second, mirrorless, whatever. Now, the idea here is the car in this particular case is moving horizontally. It's moving from right to left on a horizontal or x-axis. So try to keep your subject, the car in this case, in the center of your viewfinder as you move as smoothly as possible to track it, to follow it. And as you're holding down the shutter button, you'll find that as long as you keep it centered in the viewfinder as you're moving gently the camera, one of those images will be a good keeper of a panning shot. Now, keep your elbows tucked into your chest. Don't use live view. Look through the viewfinder. Don't hold your arms out extended. Make life easy for yourself. Keep your shoulders, your feet shoulder width apart. Just sort of rotate from your planted, rotate your upper bodies as you're tracking your subject. Obviously, if you're at an air show, you may be tracking vertically or following a helicopter or diagonally if it's an airplane or whatever it may be. But if it's a car in this case, just keep your feet planted. And you'll find with a bit of practice that you will succeed quite quickly with this. Just it's very, very important to note that if you're moving horizontally, tracking a car like this, don't move your camera up and down. Just make conscious effort to only move it horizontally, because if you start moving horizontally and up and down, you're moving into intentional camera blur and you'll get this very blurry abstract image. So it was very important to just move, in this case, from right to left, on a horizontal axis. And then you get this really nice sort of panning and sense of motion there. Now, this is finally the final ones for blurs. So thank you for not all walking out, hopefully, so far. But not a technique I use, but here for completeness, really. I have to confess, not only do I not use it, I've not really succeeded the few times I've tried, as you can see from this image, but having the camera on a tripod, long exposure, back to that funfair, zooming, if you've got a zoom lens, you're just rotating the zoom barrel during the long exposure, so not touching anything else, just while the exposure is being captured, the shutter's open, you're just rotating the zoom barrel. I can't remember if I zoomed in or out. I think it was out in this case, and you get this sort of weird, strange effect. I'm sure some of you have tried this and got much better images, I'm sure, than I've succeeded. This is probably the better one that I managed to get. It looks like I've just put a radial blur or filter on Photoshop on this, but I assure you it's all done in camera for what that's worth. This forest was incredibly dark. It was one of those horrible days we have here quite often in the UK where the sky is just lots of high cloud, a white, purely white sky. Now, zooming in from I think it was a 16 to 35 or I think lens, just zooming out slowly during the exposure. It was a very dark forest, which has brightened up through the long exposure, but that bright sky has just been zoomed into these sort of light streaks. I know it looks like I've just tried to put light rays in, but I haven't. I assure you, it was just all done in camera, and that is just purely from the high cloud in that white sky. But there for completeness, really, to another way to use blur creatively. Now, I'm conscious it's been an hour and a bit, so I don't know if you guys want to have a little break. I'll let John make that call. I know I've covered quite a lot. I'm happy to keep going, address any questions if anyone has any, of course. But I'll put that down to you guys, really.
Okay. If anybody would like to take a break, we can go ahead and let it be known. Give you a couple minutes or a couple seconds here to respond. Anybody prefer to take a break, or shall we keep going?
Silence is golden. Or everyone's left. I'm not quite sure. I can't really see.
Oh, so we still got quite a list of folks that are in the meeting. So,
just kidding.
All right, so Greg, was that thumbs up for keep going or take a break?
I'm good either way.
I'm going. I prefer we can keep going if someone needs the. Just,
Okay.
I prefer keep going.
Okay, let's keep going.
Okay, awesome. Is that, I mean, at this point, while, you know, does anyone have any questions, or are you, oops, sorry, I keep managing to not share my screen. If anyone has any questions, you know, please do let me know. Okay, no worries. I'll keep going on. So light trails, another fantastic technique here to utilize with long exposures to create, you know, strong, powerful, energetic images. This is Tower Bridge in central London. Photographers, some of you know, we know we're using long exposures to capture the light trails of moving cars and vehicles. Now, don't forget, you'll be showing your images. I assume that you guys do sort of club competitions, but bear in mind, you know, you're going to be showing your images to a lot of non-photographers too, so they're going to get a bit of a wow factor when you see these kind of images. Capturing the movement of the cars. I'll explain in due course, you know, how to do it. You know, it really is a basis of having a remote release and triggering your shutter just before the cars move into the scene. Now, in this particular case, and again, really into the essence of some of the techniques I've been showing you, they're not all about the specifics. It's not all about star trails or blur or light trails. It's about building, utilizing these skills, utilizing these techniques, I should say, really, into your, including them, deciding when to include them in your images to build an additional layer. You know, in this particular image, I wanted to utilize light trails to, yes, show there's traffic on the bridge, but also to use it as a leading line. So now your eye is entering in from the right-hand side, whizzing down, following all those light trails into the center point of the image, which is the main focus here of Tower Bridge. So it's an additional layer that I've decided to include. There's lots of leading lines here. We've got the roadway, the fence that the camera's next to, even the pathway, even the crisscross of the wrought iron work. They're all guiding your eye towards the big tower of Tower Bridge there. It's I've used f/16 in this particular case, or yeah, I think so, f/16. You can see the aperture spikes there in the center and off into the distance, because I wanted all the bits of tarmac, all the bits of roadway in the foreground, off into the distance there in the left-hand side. That's the Tower of London. You can see a bit more of a prominent aperture spike there, all in sharp focus. So in this particular image, I've used f/16, but you don't always have to do that. This one's for you, Rick. I know you love this. You know, one of my favorites too. It's called the Burj Hakim Bridge in Paris. It's a beautiful Art Deco wrought iron bridge, quite often overlooked as a bit of a landmark in Paris. But you know, I'm standing in a cycle lane, so there's lots of leading lines here. You know, the cycle lane I'm standing in, underneath the bridge, there's those patterns there. Even the vertical pillars, they're all guiding your eye into the scene here. Now, there are light trails. You can see the car headlights and the tail lights and the reds on the other side. Now, I should really, for this presentation, include an image, this image, where I didn't have any light trails, so that you could really see what the image would look like. It would look very, very different. They're not prominent here, but they're just creating a subtle balance to balance out the image. But there's also a little bit of subtle ambient light there, artificial light, I should say, you know, that's illuminating the scene, certainly on the left-hand side with the oncoming headlights. You know, if you can just picture this as just roadway, that this grey roadway without any lights on it too, it would suddenly darken down and flatten out the image. So worth bearing in mind is keeping some light trails there, just to really, you know, add a sense of kind of warmth, electricity to your images. This image here of Buckingham Palace, I couldn't get, if I crossed over this roadway to capture in this is called the Albert Memorial for Queen Victoria's husband, I didn't have a lens wide enough with me that was going to capture that memorial and Buckingham Palace, so I had to be the other side of the road. The road was very boring, so what did I do just to fill it out and add a little bit of interest? Add some light trails into it, you know, just to add an extra element to include there, so that I could capture rather than just have a boring empty roadway. So worth bearing in mind. This one I have included, which is actually London Bridge. Again, you can see straight off the bat, aperture spikes, different lens, so it's a very more prominent kind of form of aperture spikes. Now, this one I've put in because it doesn't really work so well on the basis that you can see I've purely overexposed the image on the oncoming car headlights on the right-hand side. You can see that there's a lot of pure white there. Now, personally, I don't think that matters too much. It's all about a bit of energy in an image anyway. So yes, it's not going to win probably a Camera Club prize, but that's not the point. To me, as a photographer, it was much more important to make sure that I didn't overexpose the top of this building's called the Shard in London Bridge area. And now the top area of that, where there's a bit of a laser show going on, is in not only sharp focus, but it's correctly exposed. So you can see if we zoom into 200%, you can see all the little sort of window elements there and frames and things. So for me, that was much more important not to overexpose that. It's very difficult to control the light when your car headlights are coming toward your camera. So as I said earlier, I'm a brand ambassador for Hoya filters. Now, if you do use protective filters, as I said, I'm not a paid ambassador. I'm not trying to sell filters this evening, but something I wanted to say to you is if you use protective filters or UV filters and you're taking photos at night, and certainly ones where you've got headlights or bright lights coming towards you or street lamps like this, take those filters off your lenses. I use the protective filters when I'm at the ocean to protect my camera from sea spray and salt water and that kind of thing. But I don't, at night, I always take them off. It's very, very important. Use your lens hood. That's what it's there for, to protect your lens from stray light. If you don't, you'll find quite often that the light will enter into the camera, bounce off the glass, reflect off the filter and then back in, and you have this sort of aberration that will be captured by your in your photographs. You won't really see it that easily necessarily on the back of a small LCD screen, but when you get back, you see these sort of horrible anomalies in your photographs. So do take off these filters. They don't help you protect your camera at night with stray lights. Camera lenses are coated by the camera manufacturers. Lens hoods, I've never damaged a lens. If you're worried about scratching your lens, keeping your lens hood on, just gently put your hand over the front of the lens hood if you're walking around, and you'll find that you'll be fine. But it's very, very important. Now, yes, the overexposure is there. It can be difficult to control the light. But what I wanted to say is, what to me is the biggest sort of loser point in this image is actually that big void of black sky there. We know that, as I said earlier, we've got 4 edges of our frame. We've got to think about what elements we're putting in and where. And having a big black void of nothing space is a bit of a waste of real estate in the photograph. We know we've got limited real estate to utilize, to convey to our viewer. And to me, this is the wrong time of day. Should have been the blue hour, some cloud information there or something. Just for me, every time I look at this image, my eye is drawn to that big empty space and thinking, I wish there was something in there to fill it up. So worth considering. But something I wanted to say about light trails is that I would say a good 95% of light trail photographs that you see from, I don't know, 100% of photographers are not single images. It's so rare to have an equal balance of cars coming one direction and going the other, or whatever it may be. Here, this is the train lines here at Battersea Power Station. Any Pink Floyd fans will recognize this from an old album cover. But this is actually a multitude of exposures taken over 25, 30 minutes, something like that. The camera's on a tripod, so it's not moved. You can see all the different lights. These are the train traffic lights, the green, yellow, and red, or whatever. So I've gone overboard here to really sort of accentuate the point. But as each image is built up over different elements, the same way from the star trails, you load the stack into Photoshop. Very easy to use the light and blend mode. If you don't know how that's done, it's very simple. I've got a guide, a free guide you can download from my website for layer masks, but it's very, very simple. Here, you're not masking anything out. You're just loading the stack of images. You have your base image at the bottom that you really like, and then all the different additional layers with the different light trails, and then highlight those additional layers and just choose the light and blend mode. And what that does is it just reveals the brighter elements from those subsequent frames. And in this case, because nothing's changed other than light, as the trains have gone past, all those train lines, lights will just pop up and appear in your screen, and then you can choose which ones to include or not. So bear in mind, it's worth taking a number of shots when you do light trails, so that you can build up a nice, well-balanced image. Again, something on this image that didn't work. Obviously, you get a nice fluidity here of the cars coming towards me. You trigger the shutter just before the cars start come into the scene, or certainly as they're moving. But when you've got traffic here on the left-hand side, so this is looking down from Buckingham Palace towards Trafalgar Square. It's called Admiralty Arch. Stop-start where we had rush hour traffic. Unfortunately, you can see that with the broken tail lights there, no fluidity there, so it's quite ugly. And unfortunately, there's nothing you can do. You just have to shoot at a different time of day when traffic is much more moving. Here, this is I-95 in just outside Fort Lauderdale Airport, and in that way. Obviously, cars are not stopping on the highway, so you get a lovely fluidity there, and you get perfect time to gather in a lot of light. But again, just think about when you're going to include light trails. This is just a scene in London. It's not about the light trails, but adding that, it's leading lines guiding your eye again into the scene, but it's also adding a sense of energy and warmth. Here, earlier in the year, we had a very misty, foggy evening. I, took images of St. Paul's Cathedral without the light trails or the aperture spikes, some with the aperture spike and no light, all different combinations to see what I like, what worked, what didn't. In this particular case, I liked all three. So you build them up layer upon layer. It doesn't have to be cars, anything moving, whether it's back in Amsterdam, canal boats moving very, very slowly, or sometimes the boats have big advertising hoardings and neon lights outside. They can illuminate the scene for you in a different way. Here, bright blue hues coming off to illuminate the scene. Get up high. This is Bratislava, a small city a country, excuse me, in Europe, and getting up high, looking down on your light trails. There was a viewpoint here on this bridge, getting up high, using them as leading lines again to draw your eye up towards that church, and then diagonally over to the castle, Bratislava Castle. Pay careful attention though that you don't overexpose buildings that are illuminated, or white buildings that are illuminated at night, because obviously they will overexpose incredibly quickly. So bear that in mind. On top of the Arc de Triomphe in Paris, looking down the boulevards towards the business district, deep depth of field here. I wanted all the houses in the foreground and all the architecture in the background in sharp focus. So using f/16, a telltale there you can see with the aperture spikes. And it's something I wanted to say that quite often I get asked, you don't tell me your shutter speed, all the settings for all these shots that I've showed you. My book, Mastering Long Exposure, I have put all that information there. So all the EXIF data, the ISO, the aperture, the shutter speed, etc., what focal length, all that kind of stuff is there so that you can learn from it in the books. Partially, I can't remember it all. I could have notes, I know, but what's more important though is it's not technically that relevant. And I underline the word that. If you're standing next to me on top of the Arc de Triomphe taking this image, then yes, we're there together, and it's very important to, if I'm teaching you, to show you the settings in my camera so that we can figure them all out together for correct exposure. But there's no point telling you this was taken with, 55 seconds at f/16, because you're not there, and light's different, and light's changing very fast. It's back at the blue hour, so it's much more important to know the ballparks of how long it's going to take you to take an image like this, and then you figure it out from there yourself, because every scene is going to be different, and as I say, light changes very, very quickly. But it's knowing that if I'm at f/16 in a low light environment and I want to capture some light trails, and I don't want to overexpose all those little signs advertising those buildings, that it's going to take me at least 50-second exposure. So maybe that's a good starting point to consider what my exposure meter is going to come up with, and try test shots. Sometimes you just have to try and see what works, and with experience it will build upon that. So that's why I don't tell you necessarily all of the shutter times for my images. Now, very quickly, light painting. I don't purport to be a light painter, but it's a long exposure technique. This is actually a composite. I cheated. This is sparklers. Hopefully you know what they are, but you just light the tops of them with a lighter, and they create whatever effect. Each one is done in a composite, done individually. You can see that because they're not all joined up writing. So I've just comped those in together for fun in Photoshop. This was actually taken with a flashlight I'm wearing dark clothing, so I'm not captured with the camera on a tripod. I was feeling very clever and smug about, learning to write the word light backwards in darkness and keeping it in a very sort of horizontal way. It's more difficult than you think. And then I realized that actually all I had to do was load it into Photoshop and flip it horizontally, and everything would have been right way around anyway. So I didn't actually have to go to such extremes. But you can be limited, you're not limited to your imagination. This is a physiogram. I explain in my book how to create these, suspend a torch or flashlight from the ceiling with your camera underneath in a dark room with colored gel on a pendulum basis, pendulum motion, or you can paint light on bridges, putting colored gels on flashlights. I have an incredibly powerful LED mag light that just takes a couple of small batteries, but they're so bright, so you can utilize that. Amazon has so many different things that you can neon wire and a couple of bucks for battery operated colored cables and battery operated fairy lights and things like that. Christmas lights, whatever you call them. So you can really have some fun with light painting. The only time I do light painting is back on these star trails. This is what looks like a disused castle, but it was actually built that way in the 19th century for a big manor house in Cambridgeshire here in the UK. It was so that the lord and lady of this manor could look out their bedroom window, which was probably 3/4 of a mile away in this massive long gardens. It's one of those sort of 40-room estates, and they could look out their bedroom window and have this sort of romantic view of a disused, ruined castle. So it's called a Wimpole Folly. But again, standing there in pitch darkness, taking lots of images at 30 seconds to capture the star trails. Everything's in pitch black, so cameras on the tripod, taking images with a remote release locked open. I'm walking around with a flashlight, illuminating the scene, painting with light. And then when I load all these images into Stack and Photoshop, the same way I just explained to you with the train lines, you can then choose which elements of those images that I want to include for the illuminations. And then finally, what I'm going to spend the last remaining time that we have talking about is using what I call extreme long exposure. So using neutral density filters to extend shutter times, to create a whole array of different effects. And don't worry, I'll explain what a neutral density filter is for those who don't know. I'll explain to you how to work out all your exposure information. John, I've got a PDF guide which I'll pass on to you to pass on to everyone else if appropriate, which is my how-to, because I'm going to quickly run through how I go about using neutral density filters. Obviously, it's what works for me. It's not the only way to do it, but we'll go through that. But yeah, geometric shapes, architecture, they're two of my big passions, capturing those with the movement of time, long exposures, the movement of the clouds. Not always the movement of clouds. We'll talk about some of the examples of different things that will move throughout your image and the different effects that you can get using neutral density filters. But obviously the movement of water, storms coming towards you, capturing that sort of essence there. Sometimes it's about capturing a sense of mood and essence of feeling. This is the Giant's Causeway in Northern Ireland, and rolling waves coming in and storm. Bit of a classic, my Art Deco favorites, for the Chrysler building in Midtown Manhattan, again capturing it in the middle of the day using a long exposure, and just it looks like it's been hit by a spotlight. It's just the way that the sun was popped through the clouds there during the long exposure really enables you to create that unique take on a building so iconic as the Chrysler that is photographed so many times a day. How can I create something a bit more unique, a bit more individual, a bit different to what everyone else is photographing, and using long exposures or extreme long exposures with neutral density filters. Sometimes it's client work. If I'm taking pictures of apartment buildings, it's always fun to maybe use a long exposure to chuck it in and create something a little bit different for a client perhaps may want to use for advertising. Lookups, so looking vertically straight up the side of a mirrored building, getting those lovely reflections there, creating something asymmetric, with a long exposure using neutral density filters. And minimalism. I'm currently writing a book on minimalist photography at the moment, and it's a big passion for me of subject matter. What am I looking at? Why? What's going on with this crane in a disused quarry? Removing distraction, using here a 10-stop neutral density filter on a misty day to remove any of those distracting elements there and really strip back your scene to a basic subject matter, and real sort of impact, creating images of what am I looking at and why, that sort of thing. Or things with negative space, positioning things to become a bit more tranquil here. This, removing those ripples that would be on this water here. Yes, the clouds were not particularly interesting in one of those typical white skies, but nevertheless, it's about balance and serenity and creating something a bit more spacious and tranquil to look at. Well, and again, sometimes you just want to use a neutral density filter. Similar scenes, common scene of Westminster, Houses of Parliament, Big Ben, however you want to describe the scene in central London, flattening out the River Thames, capturing a strong movement, high contrast, perhaps a little bit overbaked, depends on your take. But again, your audience who don't know how this is created, getting to see something they wouldn't ordinarily get to see. So what gear do we need to take a long exposure with the neutral density filter? Well, I've talked so much about remote shutter releases, tripods, I promise I won't mention again. Bulb mode, I've explained what that is. So you need to use bulb mode if you're shooting beyond 30 seconds on most cameras. Manual mode will enable you to dial in the ISO, aperture, and up to 30 seconds for an exposure. But when we're talking about, a 16-stop neutral density filter, you can take a 9-minute, 10-minute exposure or more. So you're not able to do that on a normal DSLR without using a bulb mode. Funnily, I was saying to John earlier, I was very fortunate to be loaned. I was the shortlisted finalist for the last 6 for the Hasselblad Masters competition late last year, and very recently I was loaned by Hasselblad for a project a Hasselblad camera, and it was joy to use. But actually, it's interesting that you can dial in as long as you want, pretty much. So you could dial in a 2-hour exposure if you want. Excuse me, you're not limited on a Hasselblad. I don't understand why most camera manufacturers don't do the same thing. It's obviously just a software-based thing. So don't know why you need to use bulb mode. But anyway, nevertheless, something I did want to mention that's very useful is now that the weather is changing, excuse me, I'm clearly not used to talking for 2 hours at a pop, but spare batteries. The weather's changing, colder weather. A top tip that I found works very, very well is if your battery runs out, to take it out, if you don't have a spare, is to take it out and put it in your trouser pocket, your jeans pocket, whatever. A bit of natural body warmth will revitalize it a little bit, bring it back to life. And you, after 5-10 minutes in your pocket, your trouser pocket, you'll find that body heat's warmed it up, put it back in, and it will work again and give you more shooting, surprisingly a longer period of time than you may have thought that you had. Don't artificially heat it up with a light or anything like that. So just use a bit of natural body warmth and you'll find it will come back to life. Very useful if you find yourself in a location where you haven't packed a spare or you forgot to charge it or whatever. So what is a neutral density filter? It's clearly a dark piece of glass. We restrict the amount of light that comes through, as I've written there. We know we measure light in stops of light from our exposure meter. So you would think logically that all the manufacturers would say, well, this is a 6-stop filter or a 10-stop filter or whatever, which is the easiest way to determine how strong the filters are. But different filter companies use different ways to describe them. Hoyer, the company that I was using still obviously do as a brand ambassador, but using for a very long time, use the filter factor. So a 6-stop neutral density filter is an ND64. The Lee filter system, another fantastic filter company. I have their filters. I don't really like the square filter system, but the big stopper, they call it, is a 10-stop filter, and the little stopper is a 6-stop. There's so many different ways, but it's much easier just to know that it stops 6 or 8 or 10 stops or whatever it may be. I've put a picture here of a graduated circular filter. I use Hoyer filters because they're circular. They screw onto the front of my onto the front of my lens. There are advantages and disadvantages of both. It is a graduated filter, which I have to say Hoyer sent me to test, which is not a good, as I said to them, I'm very open and honest with them. It doesn't work very well at all. It's not, I don't think it's a useful system of having a graduated circular filter. You want to position that graduation with a lot more precision as you can with a square filter system. But nevertheless, if anyone's not sure what system to buy, for completely impartial, I have integrity in myself and my work, and I'm not trying to sell Hoyle filters by any means. So if you're not sure what system is right for you, there's too many nuances to discuss here tonight. So do drop me an email. I'll be happy to give you a truly impartial benefits of both, and then you can work out what's best for yourself. Something, I think is very important to know that there are benefits for both those, so very much so, to consider that. So why do we use neutral density filters to shoot long exposures? Well, obviously the idea is to restrict the amount of light that's going to come into the camera, but sometimes why do we want to do that? And some of the blurs that I've showed you, where we're trying to take pictures of, if you want to pan a jet ski or a speedboat or whatever it may be, in the middle of the day, whizzing down the beach horizon or something like that, you're not going to be able to get away with a very long exposure to pan. So because it's just such bright light. So using a neutral density filter will restrict the amount of light in that particular case. For those of you who shoot portraits or weddings or friends and family, if you've got a fast lens, something that shoots f1.2, 1.4, 1.8, something like that, maybe 2.8, and you want to shoot wide open, so you want to shoot with that lovely shallow depth of field, get that separation between your subject and your background, that lovely sort of bokeh effect, you're not going to be able to shoot at f1.2 in the middle of the day. Certainly, again, if you're taking pictures at a wedding party without putting your subjects in under shade. So if you use a neutral density filter, it facilitates being able to do that by restricting the amount of light that can enter through the camera. Obviously, it captures a longer period of time, and there's some other creative effects when you're using neutral density filters, which I'll talk about in due course as they arise. Now, waterfalls, this is taken in Iceland for beautiful, beautiful country. I've never seen so many rainbows and waterfalls in my life. Waterfalls are a lovely thing to see as humans, but also as photographers, beautiful to capture. Using a neutral density filter really facilitates getting that dreamy-like, ethereal feeling of movement of water there. So I'll talk you through this because I'm conscious of time, but obviously the image straight in the top, straight out of camera, top left of this sort of waterfall weir, you can see all the ripples of the water there. Just looks like it's taken with a phone, but it was just a DSLR. This is what we see with the human eye, freezing motion. Adding a 10-stop neutral density filter, same area, literally taken back to back. I've just zoomed into some of those rocks in the center of the image. You can see a prominent effect there, very, very different, how the water just becomes this lovely dreamy effect. You can't easily replicate this. You have to use a bit of Photoshop trickery to fake this, and it's a very laborious, but it's much more fun doing these things in camera. But you can create these wonderful, wonderful views of lovely sort of dreamy effects of the water there. It's something that's worth bearing in mind, though, that using a polarizer, I've used a polarizer together with a neutral density filter here. Now, a polarizer, for those who don't know, it's like your sunglasses, really. It reduces glare and reflection, or limits them. So a polarizer itself will restrict 1, perhaps 2 stops of light, depending on the strength of the filter, depending on what brand you use. So if you're stacking that together with a 6-stop neutral density filter, you're suddenly restricting 7, maybe 8 stops of light. So you need to consider that. But they're also, as I say, they remove glare. So this image in the top left, Everglades in Florida, straight out of camera, no filters. You can see this alligator. Alligators are incredibly smart. They know that they can rely on camouflage from the glare of the water when they're hunting. They're so smart, really are. But again, just putting a polarizing filter onto your camera, rotate it clockwise. It's always good practice to rotate the polarizers clockwise, and then you won't accidentally unscrew them and drop them on the floor and break them. They're expensive to fix, to replace, which, speaking of experience. So top tip there is to rotate them clockwise. When you get to a full circle, it will reset and start again anyway. And you can see the same alligator with a polarizer in the bottom left cuts through that glare. The only filter, the only thing we really can't replicate in post-production at all is a polarizer. So always worth having one in your bag, reducing the glare, and suddenly we can see the whole of the alligator cut through. We can even see the rocks at the bottom of the Everglades there. And then if you like wildlife, you can use better composition and better angles and better light and create, images like the image on the right there. I'm not really, I enjoy taking pictures of wildlife, but certainly not holding out to be a professional, but certainly do enjoy it. And polarizers can help you really gather this one obviously looks like it's just floating, doesn't it? So I go back on point though, fountains, waterfalls don't always have to be natural. So fountains at night can, long exposures can really capture that sort of fluidity of water. And equally here, sometimes you don't need to have a very strong filter. 6-stop neutral density filter was sufficient in this case. This beautiful waterfall back in Iceland, high contrast, black and white, very nice combination there. But also it was, 100 foot or so, 100 feet drop. So the water was cascading down. So I didn't really need to use a very long shutter time there to capture the blur. Just pay careful attention. You can see I've almost probably have slightly overexposed there in the center. I don't think it really detracts because you have to draw your eye to those overexposed parts, but just be careful to pay careful attention to highlights when you're using neutral density filters. They will easily overexpose when you're taking photos of waterfalls. Now sometimes you're fortunate to find waterfalls and water and the ocean together. Here in Ireland, there's lots of combinations of both. Similar to waterfalls and water, generally it's using neutral density filters. I wanted to say on the top left, this is the Thames barrier, so it prevents flooding in the river along the Thames River to prevent flooding in the City of London. Straight out of camera, top left, we can see the River Thames and what it really looks like to the naked eye, quite murky, choppy. Forget the cloud cover. You can see there's high cloud and low cloud, and you can see how that's sort of reflected slightly on the water in that top left image, but you can see it's very, very choppy. Putting on a 10-stop filter on the top right image, suddenly very, very different image, draws the eye into the subject there, removes all those ugly distractions of those ripples. Yes, we can see the movement of the clouds, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Yes, the reflections of those clouds are much more prominent on the water, but something there to say that they're called neutral density filters. You can see that image straight out of camera is not neutral, it's blue, very strong blue hue that needed to be color corrected. So important to shoot raw when you're using neutral density filters. I'm currently testing some filters from Hoya that are beautifully color accurate. Actually, they're incredible at the moment. So I'm sure most of the big brand manufacturers are doing the same thing with their various ambassadors. And that's something I'll talk about in a minute, about choosing filters and different companies. I was going to say something a bit more sort of pronounced about it, but really, you spend so much money, we as photographers spend so much money on glass, good glass, and our cameras, lenses. Don't sell yourself short by just buying a cheap filter set from eBay or whatever it is, or Amazon, a couple of bucks for a whole range of filters. You spend thousands of dollars on good glass, spend a little bit on the filters. You don't have to go crazy, but just buy a filter system or filters if you're tempted to do this, having seen more images, that you stick with a brand that you recognize. So Stingray, Hoya, Lee, Tiffin, Koken, they're all good brands. They're all fantastic quality. Just don't go to those sort of unnamed Chinese brands that you just, or unnamed products that you just don't know. The quality's not there. There's no point putting a $2 filter in front of a $1,000 lens. You're going to get what you pay for. So better to spend 50 bucks and get something that you know is going to work properly. But again, you don't, excuse me, you don't have to flatten water out completely. You can create a lovely sort of dreamy effect. I was very fortunate here. The sun peeked out and it highlighted those waves rolling in on the horizon and then disappeared again. So it's like it put this lovely highlight there for me. Crashing waves, capturing the time, there was sort of 6-7 foot waves smashing on the rocks and retreating, smashing and receding. So lovely time to use a neutral density filter here to capture that sort of movement. This one I used a 10-stop filter. We'll talk about choosing what strength filters in a moment. But back to the sort of minimalist photos, these fishing huts we have here along the Thames estuary. Again, very stark, high sort of subject, all about the subject matter there, no distraction, using the neutral density filters to flatten out the environment there. This wouldn't work so well with choppy water and ripples, but it creates a much more serene scene. Equally so, you don't necessarily have to flatten out the water with all its detail to disappear. Sometimes leaving a little bit of surface information by controlling your shutter times creates a real feeling of gentleness and tranquility. But then sometimes it's nice to completely flatten out the water. Little town back in Montenegro called Sveti Stefan, utilizing a long exposure there to flatten out the water and the beach line, and obviously there's movement in the clouds, using the curvature of the beach there as a leading line to draw your eye around to those terracotta rooftops of what you can see there, where I wanted your eyes to get to. So removing the distractions there, using the neutral density filters for that purpose. These were old sea defences from World War II in the North Kent coast and the southeast of England here. Again, converting to black and white for high contrast effects. But if I had not used a neutral density filter to flatten out the water, this image, those sea defences would have all got lost with all the ripples of the water. So it's amazing over the period of time how using these neutral density filters and long exposures flattens out the water there. Underneath jetties, you get the idea. Sometimes you don't want to flatten the water, as I mentioned earlier, and you could use, say, for example, just enough time to slow down time a little bit. This is a 2-stop neutral density filter just to get those crashing, stormy waves, sense of motion and energy and power, the stormy shot. So worth bearing in mind that, sometimes you want the tranquility, like here, of the meandering waters and valleys and abstract images, that sort of things. Sometimes you don't. Very briefly, clouds we can utilize as well with long exposures. When we've got the sky coming, the clouds or the wind blowing towards you or from overhead, from behind, you can get this lovely sort of streaking effect where you can almost use them as a leading lines, the movement of the clouds. So it can be quite interesting when shooting clouds in different directions. Here it was a very blustery scene at sunset, so the clouds were getting blown all different directions, as you can see, and it sort of adds another layer of interest. Going back to what I was saying earlier, building up layer upon layer of your images. Yes, it was lovely sort of scene, picturesque lighthouse, etc., but using a neutral density filter to capture the winds howling around in different directions as I said, an extra layer of interest to an image. This is quite a fun image, one of my favorites, taken in the middle of the day along the River Thames, looking up the side of a mirrored glass building. Blue sky day, so converted the blues to blacks and the white clouds as it streaks through the day there. So creating something very abstract, very different that you wouldn't ordinarily get to see with the naked eye. Obviously converting things slightly and having a bit of artistic license on the windows, but nevertheless, the sky there is something, getting that movement to anchored in. If you have that, as I said earlier, juxtaposition between movement and stability really adds something extra to your images. Looking up on buildings and architecture can be, fantastic ways to create strong compositions. Yes, the sunlight can pop out sometimes and highlight as it did on the water before. So as fast moving cloud, don't despair if the sun, comes out and hides again. Sometimes it's just high and low cloud, so the sun won't even appear, but it's just bright cloud and low cloud. The sunlight is reflected on the angular building in this particular case, so worth bearing in mind. It can really help accentuate angles of view. If you've got high cloud, like we quite often do, thick cloud in the UK, certainly in this time of year, very unexciting. Unfortunately, no neutral density filter is going to help you there. Yes, you get lovely movement in the water, but you just get this big white blobby sky. And equally so, those landscape photographers amongst you guys will relate to this one. You're sitting waiting for the perfect placement of cloud for a sunset, and then suddenly it all just disappears and dissipates. And you're like, oh, where's it all gone? And you're just left with a bit of a damp squib of a sunset. So no neutral density filter is going to help create clouds. Now, I talked about some benefits for using neutral density filters, and people removal is one of them, and a lot of photographers don't realize you can utilize neutral density filters to remove people, eradicate them from a scene. Sorry for, not the greatest photo, but really just to accentuate back on that Millennium Bridge in central London. Yes, I didn't need a big arrow, but yeah, you can see people walking across the bridge straight out of camera, literally put a 10-stop filter on, or 6-stop filter on this. And just as the people walk through the scene, they've disappeared. Now, movie guys use these sometimes when they need to clear people out of scenes. But photographers, you may find yourself on vacation somewhere, you can't get up really early because of family commitments. Your wife and kids don't want you to get up at 4 o'clock and disappear. You may be on a tour bus. You may, if you go to visit the Taj Mahal in India, there's always a queue of people waiting to get in through the main gate, and at night queuing, being thrown out. So you'll never get certain locations to yourself. So how do you remove tourists? Well, camera on a tripod, use a long exposure with a neutral density filter. You may need to take more than one shot. This is a university campus in Vienna in Austria. Probably 50, 60 students walk through this image during the exposure time. Now, one gentleman stood very still. He was, I can't remember if he had a cell phone or smoking a cigarette, but he was standing roughly about the third white square in from the left-hand side and stood there for a little while talking or smoking. So what did I do? Just waited for him to leave and then took another image and then literally loaded the two into Photoshop, and then I could just paint that little square back in because the camera's not moved, and the skies are different and things like that. So it's always worth bearing in mind taking a couple of images, but again, as long as people are moving through your scene, then they won't get captured. This old castle in Ireland, I've circled here so you can see where people have moved around. That's that sort of ghosting effect. Very easy to clone out, but obviously I've left it here just for demonstration purposes of what happens when people move around, but slowly move, move over and then stop and stay stationary during a long exposure. But again, it can be a little bit more tricky if people are coming towards you rather than moving horizontally, because part of their body will always be in front of the camera, so you may need to take more than one, more than a few shots. So bear that in mind, and be careful if you're taking photographs using neutral density filters at night. What would be a 30-second exposure or 50-second exposure with a 6-stop neutral density filter can suddenly start moving towards 15 minutes or so or beyond. So how do we take long exposures with neutral density filters? This is my PDF guide that I'm going to pass on. This is how I do it. I've broken it down into 3 parts: setup, exposure, and final steps. So the exposure is how we'll calculate, what filter to use. I realize some of you don't have neutral density filters and may want to, and I haven't spoken about what strengths, but where to start even. So bear with me and we'll talk about that in a moment. But yes, the setup, frame your composition. Always good to run your eyes around the edges of your frame. What am I taking a photograph of, what and why? But run your eyes around the edges of the frame as well. Very, very important. Very often overlooked by photographers. You may see a beautiful old oak tree and you think, well, where am I going to position this? Looking through the viewfinder on the left rule of thirds or over on the right or whatever it may be. And you spend so much time, focusing on that particular subject matter that you don't notice that when you get home, oh no, there's a trash can on the bottom left-hand corner. If only I'd taken a couple more paces around over to the right, I would have got an equally good composition or perhaps a stronger composition, but also I don't have to spend, cloning time now on Photoshop to remove that or go back and retake the shot. So good practice not to become so obsessed with your composition, framing your composition, that you don't run your eyes around the edges of your frame before you take your shot. At this point, lock the camera down on your tripod. I attach a camera remote, as I said, with the caveat I use a wired remote, not having any batteries to fail on me while I'm out in the field. Turn off image stabilization, vibration reduction for you Nikon. You guys are all using Nikon, I think. Good practice to turn it off. Surprisingly, if you don't, and certain lenses, certainly with Canon, those I shoot, will communicate with the camera and tell the camera that it's on a tripod, and it will override and turn off the image stabilization. Some don't, and I can never remember which ones do, which ones don't. It's good practice to turn them off, because if they don't communicate with the camera, then actually, surprisingly, the lens and camera will introduce a bit of vibration and a bit of motion, I should say, because it's trying to neutralize non-existent motion. And it gets confused, so it actually introduces some, and then you end up with slightly blurry images. So good practice, turn that off. Focus, great if you want to use autofocus, but just remember, once you obtain focus, put it into manual focus mode. I personally like to focus using live view, and I've zoomed into 100%. Manual focus never lets me down personally. And then at this point, we're not putting any filters on. but we're going to put the camera into aperture priority mode. Purely for the basis at this point that our cameras are fantastic tools, and we're going to utilize them as a tool. And I think it's important to dial in the depth of field that's required, as I've written here, for the scene. Now, quite often students in the field say, well, don't I just put my camera onto f22, f29, make the aperture as small as possible, and then that restricts the amount of light that can get through into the camera, enabling me to take a very long exposure with the neutral density filter. Now, that's not the correct way to do it. Depth of field is still important. Do we have anything in the foreground and the background we want in sharp focus? We've talked about depth of field, and I'm sure most of you know about that anyway. It's very integral for the basics of photography and exposure triangle, etc. Not the right way to do it. So dial in the correct exposure, the correct aperture for the depth of field that's relevant. I think that if you find that you're not getting a long enough exposure with the filter that you have, then you need to buy a stronger filter. Yes, if you push comes to the shove, you can shoot at f16 rather than f8, for example. But I'm trying to teach the correct way to do it. So bear that in mind, that aperture priority mode. At this point, we set the camera to the lowest ISO, native ISO, so Canon ISO 100. Turn off auto ISO, that's a great function to use, but not in this case. You don't want the camera to be doing any other calculations for you when you're making any corrections and setting adjustments. At this point, we take a test image, no filters yet. So we've got the camera in aperture priority mode, ISO, lowest ISO, so for me, ISO 100 on a Canon. Take a test image and take a mental note of the shutter speed that the camera has worked out for you. And if you're happy, check the histogram with those caveats I mentioned earlier. Use exposure compensation if necessary to make any necessary adjustments. But if you're happy with what the camera, the image looks like on the back of the LCD, then we've got to the point where we're ready to apply the neutral density filter. Now, as I say, I haven't spoken about neutral density filters and which ones to buy, other than stick to a brand that you recognize. If you haven't gotten any neutral density filters and you attempted to try this, I would recommend starting with a 6-stop neutral density filter. And there's a few reasons for that. The first is that you get the benefits of a lot of the techniques and things that I've showed you, removing people, capturing long periods of time where we can, capture the movement of clouds and water and what sort of stuff, and flattening it out. But also the price point is a good entry point as well, because, certainly a 10-stop neutral density filter here in the UK is about $130, something like that, £100 for a branded one, whereas it's a lot cheaper for a 6-stop filter. So it's a good price point to move in. If you find that you like it, then the natural progression will be to move towards a 10-stop filter. But you should already have a polarizer as well. So you could combine those, as I mentioned earlier, and have maybe a 7-8 stops of light reduction anyway. So you get the best of both worlds. But it's a good place to start, I think. So in this particular case, we're going to say in our pretend example that I've set the camera to ISO 100, aperture priority mode. The camera's given me a resulting shutter speed of 1/15 of a second. And we're going to calculate with a 6-stop neutral density filter the new shutter speed. So how do we do this? This is the mathematic part that lots of photographers don't like, but doesn't have to be complicated. We're literally doubling the shutter speed, as I've written here, for each stop of light we're reducing. So we're doubling 6 times because we've adding a 6-stop filter in this example. So I've written it there in white at the bottom where it says, e.g. base exposure 1/15 of a second. Excuse me, I didn't say f11 is our desired aperture, a nice mid-ground, ISO 100, we're adding in a 6-stop filter, and the resulting shutter speed is 4 seconds. Some of you will know hopefully all of you know your shutter speed fractions in seconds. But if you don't, there are plenty of free apps you can have on your phone. I've got one on mine called LE Calculator app. It's a free one for when my brain's not working, coffee's not kicked in. I'm using a 16-stop plus a polarizer, so it's 17 stops, and I can't work it out easily, in the middle of the morning or whatever. But a very simple way to do it is actually just to look at your camera. So if our starting point is 1/15 of a second, as I've highlighted there, we can literally just click it 6 times. So 1/8 is 1 stop of light, 1/4 of a second is 2 stops, half a second is 3, 1 second 4, 2 seconds for 5 stops, and it takes us for 6 stops for our 6-stop filter to 4 seconds. We can dial 4 seconds in and we're ready to take the shot. If it was a 10-stop filter in this particular case, we would then go from 4 to 8 to 15 to 30 to 1 minute. Now, bear in mind, as I said before, most DSLRs, most mirrorless cameras don't let you shoot beyond 30 seconds. So if it was a minute, you'd have to put the camera into bulb mode, where you would dial in ISO 100, f11, and then you would have to use a remote release to open the shutter, leave it open for 1 minute, or if you have an intervalometer or whatever, you can dial, set that to be 1 minute, and then it will close. And it's really that simple. So as I've said, choose manual mode, bulb mode where applicable. Something before you click the shutter button, very quickly, to say that if you're using a DSLR, so not mirrorless shooters, but if you use just DSLRs, it's something called light leak. Now, the image on the left there, I put a big arrow to that line. Now that screen, that picture on your screen is much bigger than you would see on your LCD screen anyway, and it's very difficult to see. So I've zoomed in for you on the right hand side, and you can see that purple aberration, that anomaly there, and that is basically where the light will enter your viewfinder while the mirror is locked up and capturing the image, and bounce around and create this horror, get captured and create this sort of horrible effect. So it's worth covering your viewfinder. If you shoot Nikon DSLRs, you have a little catch, a little button, and you can close the viewfinder. If you shoot Canon like me, they have a little annoying rubber cap thing that is on the camera strap, which you either lose or change the camera strap like me. So what I would recommend is I keep some electrical tape. I think it's called that in the US too, but it's a very sort of thick tape that has a very sort of, I keep it wrapped around the legs of my tripod, and then I can unpeel it a little bit, put it lightly over my viewfinder. It doesn't leave any residue, that sticky residue, when you take it off, but it's very, very, will preclude any light. I gave a presentation last week, and I think you guys have blue tack, you know, that little sort of sticky putty sort of stuff that you use to put stuff on posters on walls and whatever. So one gentleman there used that to lightly put over his viewfinder and keep some of that in his bag. So do remember, cover over your viewfinder before you push the shutter button if you're using a DSLR, because it can be very, very difficult to see the effects of light leak in the field, and when you get back and look at your images on your screen, it can be very, very frustrating. So once you then take your image, review it, check the histogram with the caveats I've said, zoom in, make sure that focus is sharp, because obviously if we've got winds and you're by the coast or whatever, you know, capturing the movement of water by the ocean, camera's going to vibrate, so make sure everything's in sharp focus. Check your composition again. Things may have blown in, tree branches or whatever that weren't in your composition when you started. Obviously, with the caveats, if it's under or overexposed, then you may need to jig your exposure settings and retake the images, but also take a few images, because obviously you've gone to great lengths to set everything up. The cloud movement, the water, whatever the moving element is that you're capturing will be different each time you take the photo. So take a couple, but then don't get what I call lead feet, where you come back after, 2 hours shooting and then you realize, oh my God, I've got 15 of the same images. And if only I'd gone over a few paces over to the right or gone somewhere else, I would have captured a nicer angle of view. So don't have too many of the same image. Yes, you'll have to take the filter off and start the process again, but enjoy that. It shouldn't be a burden. You should get to enjoy looking at the scene while your camera is capturing the exposure. Now, stacking filters, circular filters, the screw-in filters. Here, there's more examples on the far left and far right of light leak again. So yes, those vertical lines you could clone out, but sometimes it will destroy images. And here's some prime examples of, it's not worth fixing this kind of image. Now, I actually did this image deliberately stacking 3 filters, a polarizer and 2 neutral density filters to get this effect. And I really wanted just to emphasize, in this case, what's in the center, and that's that strong vignetting, and the vignettes are those darkening of the corners. Now, what you're actually seeing there is the inside of the filters, the bezels of the filters, because they're protruding from a wide angle lens, a 16mm and a full frame. So if you shoot very wide shots and you're going to use filters or stack filters, bear this in mind, that the main ways, there's only 3 real ways I can find to alleviate this problem. The first is to shoot wider than you would ordinarily shoot and crop your image. not ideal necessarily. The second is maybe buy slim filters. You can buy slim filters which are just the bezels are a bit thinner, the glass is a bit thinner, the quality's still there, but you can stack those and then they won't protrude as far. But if you find that you're constantly going to be shooting with wide angle lenses, then I do recommend moving away from the Hoyer and the screw-in filter system and going into the drop-in square filters, where the filters are much bigger than the diameter of your lens, and then you won't encounter this problem. Yes, as an architectural photographer, I know my verticals are not vertical, but sometimes that can be fun too. What I wanted to zoom in and show you was sensor dust. Your cameras will be incredibly unforgiving when it comes to long exposures there with sensor dust. Hot pixel highlighted as well for good measure. But I just wanted to say, as a commercial photographer, it would be unforgivable for me to send work to clients with sensor dust in there. It doesn't take very long to run your eyes, zoom in at 300% and go line by line, you know, horizontally or vertically or whatever, certainly in the skies, looking for sensor dust. Easy one click to clone it out in Lightroom or Photoshop or whatever software you use. If you use Lightroom, go to the clone tool and then you can click that checkbox on the bottom left of visualize spots, and it will show you those straight away for you to be able to sort of zoom in and see and deal with in one click. And then have some fun with your long exposures, whether you're looking up between walkways and buildings, looking across into the horizon, compositions, breaking those rules. Last time I'll talk about the starburst effect, but shooting at f16 with a neutral density filter, you can still get that little starburst effect. Create mystery and intrigue, as I mentioned at the beginning. You know, what am I looking at? What's going on? Why is there a gate going down into water that's been flattened? Whatever. Capture people with 10-stop neutral density filters. For example, you could capture yourself. You could run and stand still for a second and then move to another place and another place and have multiples of yourself. You know, you're limited to your imagination, really. Frames around frames. Composition is still key. Don't forget your composition is very, very important. Just because you're using a neutral density filter, you know, there's a lot, you're just adding another aspect of consideration to your photographs. But again, it's something, as I've said earlier on, it's about building these all up, utilizing different techniques, knowing when you can and should and want to use all these different techniques that I've showed you this evening. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is my presentation on mastering long exposure. So yeah, I'm not sure if anyone has any questions, or I'll let John take over.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Anthony. And that was a fantastic presentation. I got to tell you, I really appreciate all of the details and your tips and your instructional information that you included here. We do have a few questions that came up during your discussion. And the first one that came up, and going back to your urban scenes, what kind of long exposure techniques do you use to show people walking in an urban setting?
So if I'm going to, I mean, obviously to capture someone walking generally, you need to shoot around 1/200th of a second, which is not going to give you sufficient light to capture someone walking in a night environment unless it's illuminated. But, you know, to capture those lovely sort of blurred people, then obviously you need to, I think there's a little bit of trial and error when you want to capture people moving. I mean, a lot of people, will cheat and they'll take 2 images and comp them together with that person, because it's just not possible. If you're taking a 40-second exposure, then that person's going to disappear, like I've just showed you with neutral density filters. Those people are going to walk through the scene and not be captured. So there's an element of trial by fire, I guess. You know, if you can get away with a 2-3 5-second exposure for the scene, then you're going to get that nice sort of blurred effect, and it's a bit of a ghostly effect, which you saw in one of those images and earlier on. So I think to have someone in a night urban environment walking is realistically, when you're talking about a night scene, not beyond when it's getting quite dark, I think you're going to find that you really are probably going to have to composite 2 images really to get someone that's sharp. You're just not going to be able to do that in one image.
Okay. Next question is, what techniques do you use to keep the main subject well exposed? And I think you may have talked about that, but if you could just recap real quickly, that would
Yeah,
be
sure.
great.
So, I mean, the most important thing is, so, I mean, again, like say, for example, in those urban images, I spoke about the clock faces and things like that and the buildings and, it's very, very important to watch out for the highlights. So, whether it's light trails or whatever it is that you're exposed, expose for the brightest elements. I know there's that sort of exposed to the right rule, and there's different ways to do it, different techniques, but I find that, I prefer to, once you've broken through and you've overexposed something, that information's gone, and it's much easier to do that when you're using a long exposure than underexposing. So it's better to watch out for those highlights and then work backwards and open out the shadow information if you need to, the dynamic range there, rather than, sort of exposing for the left and then going the opposite direction. So control your scene. Yes, some experience will take you down the road to where that if the blue hour, I only need to shoot for about between 10 and 15 seconds or something like that to get a nice exposure, check the highlights. That highlight priority warning is very, very useful on the back of the camera. So you could see straight off the bat, where where you're overexposing and then, or underexposing it equally, and then you can work from there. But I think it's watch for those highlights first, because there's nothing worse getting back and you've blown out highlights.
And speaking about exposure, what type of metering mode is good for a long exposure? So you talked about using aperture priority mode, but I don't recall you talking specifically about what metering mode you prefer or recommend.
No, I didn't actually. Yeah, that's interesting. I'd actually just keep my camera on evaluative. So Matrix, I think it is on Nikon. I think the meters are so phenomenal. Spot metering is not, I mean, it's better that the matrix or evaluative is going to take a little bits of information from all around your scene, your composition. So a spot, say the image in front of you, for example, where are you going to put the spot mode? It's not going to be useful. It's much better to get an all round, and then, because you're putting the camera into aperture priority mode first, to let it calculate the correct exposure based on all that information that it's got. So I leave the camera on that matrix or evaluative, and it pretty much lives on that for long exposures. Obviously, within reason,
Right. Speaking of reason, I mean, as you probably well know, when you start calculating some of these exposures, especially in darker scenes, you can get into, well, even during the daytime, if you're really wanting to get to it, you can get into some minutes long exposure. And you were talking about how most of our DSLRs have 30 seconds. So the question is, how do you calculate exposures of several minutes? And I'm going to throw this out there, a little nuance to the question as well. It's been my experience that filters are not always honest in their stops. Yeah, you talked about experiment and test it and adjust your settings. So I'll go back to the question. So how do you calculate accurately for those minutes long exposures?
Well, yeah, I mean, that can be difficult, right? I mean, ultimately, I don't think that there's an easy way. Yes, neutral density filters, for example, are not 100% accurate. You'll find that, you can work it all out, charts and whatever, which is why, I'm teaching the correct way to do it. But then there is a rule of, a rough guide, you'll figure out with experience and repetition, like anything. You get a sense of how fast, for example, clouds are moving, and then roughly that if I dial in a certain amount of time, I'm going to lose all that movement, and too little it's going to be underexposed. So you get to gauge certain things, for example, there. Very quickly on filters, I was also going to say, quite often I'm asked about a variable neutral density filter, for example, rather than just buy a 6 or a 10 star. Why not get a variable where you can then rotate it and get stronger or weaker effect? And I find those are incredibly imprecise. They may say that they go from 3 to 10 stops, but I've got two, actually. I've got a Stingray and a Hoyer one, and I both do not go to the density that they say that they're going to do that, but for sure.
And so you can get the effect on it if you're not careful.
Horrible, isn't it? I think it's because they're two polarizing filters that work together, and it gives that horrible anomaly. Yeah, you just can't get rid of it. It's so frustrating.
Now, on the other hand, if you're doing video, a variable ND can be a big help in video, but I did have one for a little while and got rid of it because for my still photography,
Yeah. The Stingray one here is about £200. So what's that, like $300 or something, you know, or close to. It's expensive. And yeah, for what you're getting. But yeah, for when you're talking about long exposures, I do think, unfortunately, it is a bit of a trial by fire. Like I don't think that there's an easy way. You can get a rough idea from experience. You know that once the blue hour's gone, it's a black sky and you're in a low light environment, there's just some very faint light. Then yeah, unfortunately. The other thing to do though, and I did find myself, and I was doing this a little bit actually interestingly with the Hasselblad while I was in my project, because I was doing some night photography with it, and was actually to bump the ISO up. So what I did is I put it onto 200,000, whatever, 256,000 or whatever the number was, crazy, that I knew I wasn't going to be using, but just to make sure, but also a little bit to check focus as well. But that would then give me a ball, and then I could work backwards, because I can then keep halving it backwards. So, that's a quick way to do it, is to work backwards that way, rather than waste 2 minutes. I know it sounds awful to say waste 2 minutes of your life standing somewhere beautiful, perhaps, but it can be frustrating after 2 minutes or 3 minutes and it's still pitch black and you're like, oh, give me a break, so so put it onto the highest ISO. Bear in mind that you're not going to be using that as your keeper for sure, right? Because unless it's a dragon flying through the sky with a dolphin in its mouth, ISO 200,000 or whatever it is useless for anyone, right? So maybe a paparazzi or something, but for us, we want to have the best quality. So,
and the last question we have in the chat is, you and I, for example, we were just talking about DSLRs, and the calculations for DSLRs. Is there any difference in your long exposure techniques or recommendations for mirrorless users?
That's interesting, actually. I still use a DSLR. I've actually been, I've been loaned a Canon R5, which is a phenomenal camera too. To be honest with you, I've not really found any differences in that respect. Like correct me, please. I'm interested actually if anyone wants to interject and has found anything, because yes, there are other aspects. Like I've taught students, for example, with Olympus cameras where they're using neutral density filters, but they can watch on the back of the screen. I don't know if you've seen that. And there's certain Olympus cameras where they can see it's a bit like being in the darkroom again, and you can see the formation of the image in real time with a neutral density filter. So you can override, if you dialed in, it's going to take 2.5 minutes or whatever it may be. And then after 1 minute and 30 seconds, you're happy with the exposure, you can shut it off there. Whereas on a Canon or a Nikon or whatever, you're locked in, right, until you finish that sequence. So that's quite interesting to see. Like the technology is definitely moving on in that regard. But for the basic stuff, like I still think it's, the exposure triangle is still the exposure triangle, no matter whether you're mirrorless or DSLR.
All right. Any other last minute questions, considering that for Anthony, it's coming up on 2:30 in the morning?
That's all good. And I appreciate Richard's little note. Yeah, I think sometimes I didn't realize actually the break is good for my voice, but no, I'm happy. I'm all good. I love doing what I do, and I love teaching. And like I said sincerely at the beginning, and my contact information is still on the screen. Like, if anyone's got any questions that they don't want to ask, or they may arise in 6 months' time, just drop me an email. I'm always happy to address them. Yeah, I'm not very good at marketing myself. Go check out my books. If you want to know more information, you can get them all on, like I said, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, whatever, all the good bookstores. So there's a lot of information there. But I have a lot of free information on my website. I'm self-taught. I learned from reading a lot and trial and error and that kind of thing. And I'm happy to share. Like I don't ever really want to charge for stuff. So I like passing on.
Anthony, I'm go ahead. Somebody else online.
Oh, hi. This is Howie. I just want to say that, great presentation. Thank you for, all you have offered, and, guy like George. And thanks again, John. That's a great job doing and putting together. Because, hope to see you again soon and some other topic, Anthony.
Oh, that's very kind. Yeah, well, hopefully I'll be next time. It'd be lovely if you guys have a meeting in person at some point to, come and meet everyone and, I'm always looking for an excuse to cross the big pond. So, tie that in with something maybe that could be fun. Go back and see some family and friends and things. So, no, that's very kind of you. Thank you. Obviously, it's fantastic for me to Zoom is an amazing opportunity to get to talk to other clubs as well that I wouldn't ordinarily be able to do quite so easily. So that's always good.
Absolutely.
And if anyone's ever in the UK, do feel free to come say hi and whatever.
Well, there were a lot of other comments in the chat saying, great job, appreciate it, thank you, awesome work. keep it up, and basically anytime you want to come back, we're welcome to you. Anthony, and again, great job. I'm going to go ahead and click on stop the recording, and with